I want to ask Chairman Coleman if he'd open us with an invocation. What number are you, 22?
Let us pray, please. Most gracious Heavenly Father, we come to you today just, first of all, dear God, thanking you for allowing us to live here in this great country, first of all, and especially this great city and this great community we live in, this great state. Dear God, we're so thankful for all the people that are here today. We know they're concerned. We know they have reasons for being here, and they're concerned about the betterment for our children and the growth of our great country. We ask that you be with everyone here today as we talk, we discuss, and we listen to the things that are going on. We ask you, dear God, to please give us a clear head, give us a cool heart, a warm heart, and give us the wisdom to let us know to do what's right for the boys and girls of this great state. We ask you to go with us now, lead and guide and direct us. We ask these things in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. As you know, this is a joint meeting between the House and Senate Education Committees. I want to welcome the House. Actually, they're welcoming us. This is their meeting room. I'm Lindsey Tippins. I chair the Senate Education Committee, and my counterpart in the House is Chairman Brooks Coleman. Chairman Coleman, you want to make any comments?
Well, I'm looking forward to this meeting. We've been looking forward a long time and hope we can get some clear answer and clear directions on where we should go. And if I may, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to call on one of the members that has a class here, and that's what it's all about. And that's Representative Carter. May I do that? And I'd like to ask her if you'd introduce some special people, Ms. Carter. Representative Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to just give you a little bit of history. Back when I had my first child, she was 4 months old. I was asked by the Leadership Lounge Group to chair the very first and found the Lounge Youth Leadership League. That was in 1999, and I, contemplated the decision with a newborn, but decided to do it. And now, 16 years later, she's a member of the class. And so today I bring to you, to the committee meeting, 33 of Lowndes County's best and brightest juniors and sophomores from all our different schools. We have public, private, homeschool even student here in this new class. And they are here to learn about state government and what we do up here in Atlanta. Most of them know me, as considering my child is a good friend to many of the students here in the class, but they've not seen me in this role. They've seen me as the high school teacher at Lowndes High School. They've seen me as the mom when they come to my house and I feed them dinner or whatever it may be, but they're seeing me in that third role that I have had the incredible privilege to do for the last 9 years. And so I appreciate them being here, but considering they are juniors and sophomores, when it was perfect that they were scheduled to come this day, because the juniors are taking U.S. history, and many of them, if not even at least half of them, are taking AP U.S. history. So this is important for them to see what we're doing. Now, they will not be here the entire time. They will be here until about 1:30, and then they'll go back to hear from other speakers. But I do want to acknowledge my daughter. She's going to be so mad at me. But Mary Alex, if you will stand, and y'all, I say this because when you're the mom of 2 children, my 2 children are 16 and 14, and I decided to run for this office when she was 7 and her brother was 5. And so for 3 months every single year, they have lived with their mother, traveling back and forth from Atlanta. And, Valdosta is not quite as close as Representative Kaiser's house, which is just down the road. So it's a haul for Mom to come back and forth, and I don't get to go home at night. And they have dealt with that for my 9th year now, and I appreciate that from them. And I will have, thanks, Mac, but I will have, if you don't mind, the Lowndes Youth Leadership League students, the 33 of you, if you'll please stand and let the group recognize you. And Brittany back here in the back, raise your hand, Brittany. Brittany was in my 1999 Lowndes Youth Leadership League class, and now she's running the program. So it's pretty awesome that we're passing it down. But anyway, thank you. Oh, Jamie Hill's back here too. She's also co-chairing taking over the committee. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I want to go over the protocol just a minute. We obviously desire for this to be a very respectful dialogue. There is concern about AP US history, and I want to have a fair and open hearing on this. I want it to be fact-based, and I want it to be very respectful of all parties. We will have two individuals who will be posing questions from about the curriculum. We'll have two individuals from College Board who will be answering those questions. After that time, we'll have opening statements from both parties on the front end. Each one of those will be limited to 10 minutes, not 10 minutes a person, but 10 minutes per entity. And after the questions are asked and answered, we may have some questions from the Senate and the House, and Senator Ligon will be asking the questions for the Senate. He has compiled some questions from the Senate members, and Representative Dudgeon from the House will be asking those questions. We want to go ahead and proceed. This meeting will be taped, and there'll be an audio and a visual tape of it that's preserved.
It's been streamed live, as we said here.
Okay. But we'll go ahead and get started. I appreciate your interest and your attendance. I want to ask Senator Ligon if you would introduce those who will be speaking, questioning the curriculum, and Callie, if you would introduce those that will be.
Mr. Chairman, may I say one thing before we start? You're going to have one or two members of this committee that will leave around 2:30 and come back. We're having to vote on the DOT board today. It's not that but we have to go vote, and we'll be coming back. So don't think we'll be back and forth, and that'll happen about 2 till about 3 o'clock, but we'll be in and out. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to first introduce Stanley Kurtz and Larry Krieger. If they would, I guess maybe they should come up and have a seat. And
yeah, just go ahead and take two of the seats at the table, and then Callie, if you would introduce the two representatives from College Board, and introduce them in their role. Just have them come forward if you would, and if you would use the mic, just if you want to use one of these mics on the corner, whatever you want to use will be fine. If you want to use the one at the table, feel free to. Okay, I believe it's good.
Callie Michael representing the College Board. Today we have Trevor Packer, who is the Senior Vice President, and he's the head of the Advanced Placement Program for the College Board since 2003. We also have Chad Hoagie, who is an AP US History teacher at the Fulton County Schools at Centennial High School, which is in Roswell.
Okay. Thank you so much. We do have 10 minutes per side, and I would ask the College Board to make their presentation first.
Yeah, pull that mic close.
Make sure that that mic is on.
Can you hear me okay? Is this picking up? Yeah. Great. My name's Trevor Packer, as Callie introduced, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. It's inspiring to see democracy in action. And frankly, if I had heard the concerns that many of you have heard about AP US history, I would be calling for just this sort of hearing. So I admire and respect the time you're dedicating to examining the facts for yourself. And I'd very much like that to be the focus of this hearing today, for us to look at these materials together, for the College Board to receive feedback, because this hearing happens during our public review period for AP US history. So that's terrific. We'll be able to take the feedback we receive from you and incorporate that into the work we're doing with college professors and AP teachers to make edits to the AP framework this summer. So we appreciate the timing of this. We appreciate your dedication to this forum and this conversation. I think this conversation has been confused with Common Core debates. And so I want to single out one very important difference between AP courses and the Common Core. As many of you know who may be concerned about the Common Core was designed to be a curriculum for all students in all grade levels. AP is very different. AP is not a standard course. It is a college level course designed to help a student earn college credit while still in high school. And these are elective courses. So what that means is that there are not schools that require students to take AP instead of a regular course. These are electives that students have the opportunity to choose to take if they already have a foundation in a discipline and want to pursue advanced studies, or if they're especially motivated or supported by their local education system. For the 60 years that the AP program has operated here in Georgia, Georgia has consistently applied a policy of respecting local control of school board selection regarding which AP courses are offered. The College Board applauds that. There are some states that do not support local control for AP courses and put in place policies that require schools to offer AP. Georgia is not one of those states. Georgia has historically respected local control and has given school boards and superintendents the liberty to choose whether to offer these elective AP courses or not. So one of the things that has concerned us about the debate here in Georgia has been a conflation of Common Core issues and AP that does not seem to represent an accurate understanding of the AP program. We've been limited to 10 minutes for these opening remarks, and I think that's great because we want to spend the time hearing questions, looking at the material together, and receiving your feedback. So in the remaining minutes, I would like you to hear from a teacher because the voices that have been most missing from this conversation here in Georgia and elsewhere have been the voices of teachers and students. Mr. Hoagie is a teacher who is not one of the hundreds of Georgia teachers that scores AP US History exams. He's not one of the college professors that develop AP US History. I felt that and when given the opportunity to bring someone with me, it will be most helpful to all of us to have someone with fresh eyes, someone who has taught the old AP framework, taught the new AP framework, and who isn't already within the group of people here in Georgia that score AP exams and tend to be more loyal to the AP program. So with that, without further ado, I'd like Mr. Hoagie to present his view as an AP US History teacher on the new and the old frameworks.
So the first thing I'd like to do is tell you a little bit more about myself. I'm born and raised in Georgia. I'm both an employee and a product of Fulton County Schools. I've taught AP World History for 10 years, and as Trevor said, I'm brand new to AP US History. I've taught it for just 2 years. And so I'm not vested in the old framework. I'm not closely associated with those that are. And I'm bringing to you the perspective of a high school teacher that read SR 80 and was really, quite frankly, bothered by it and a little hurt by it, frankly. So according to SR 80, the AP US History framework differs radically from the Georgia Performance Standards, and the A-push themes and concepts would be taught to the detriment of the mandated Georgia Performance Standards. Here's where it sort of touches me personally as a teacher, because I pride myself on the fact that I follow the curriculum, both the Georgia Performance Standards and the framework that's set out by AP. And so SR 80 makes these claims that people like me are omitting or minimizing the material. I can assure you that I do not minimize the Declaration of Independence or religion's role in our history. In fact, considering that the framework mentions religion 31 times, students in my class will have a much more comprehensive understanding of the impact of religion on our nation's history than a student who was taking a traditional on-level class driven only by the Georgia Performance Standards. Also, this question about the Founding Fathers, I think this is really just a misunderstanding. From my perspective as a teacher and somebody who lives and breathes history, when I read the curriculum framework, I saw the Founding Fathers in it. There's a document that's been provided to you that I created that's called SR 80, the rest of the story. It's in the folder from College Board that you've been given. I'd like you to take a look at that document. And
First document on the left of the packet.
so what I've done in this document is basically laid the AP framework next to the Georgia Performance Standards so that you can make decisions for yourself. And the part that I'd like to draw your attention to right now is the Founding Fathers. Here is how a U.S. history teacher reads the framework. You'll see my footnotes at the bottom. So I'd like you to take a moment to look through that, and I think what you'll find is that all of the Founding Fathers required by the Georgia Performance Standards are being taught in Georgia's classrooms. They certainly are being taught in my classroom. And what's happening here is that the framework is actually creating flexibility so that the curriculum can be satisfied. This subject is supposed to be taught in all 50 states under several different curricular requirements. the fact that the names and events are left out allows for that flexibility. It allows the teacher to satisfy the local requirements. So with that, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about how I plan. I sit at my dining room table every Saturday with my laptop in the center and the Georgia Performance Standards on one side and the AP framework on the other. First thing I do is go through the Georgia Performance Standards, identify every name, every event, everything I'm required to teach. And then I plug that into the framework as illustrative examples. So with this said, I feel pretty confident that students in Georgia are getting a balanced history of America, that students are getting the Georgia Performance Standards thoroughly taught to them.
Give us your name again.
Chad Hoagie.
Chad.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Yes, my name is Stanley Kurtz. I want to express my gratitude to Senator Ligon and to the Joint Committee for inviting me to give testimony today on the controversy over the changes to the College Board's Advanced Placement U.S. History program. I testify today as someone who has written on education issues for National Review Online and other journals of policy and opinion for nearly 15 years. I have a doctorate in social anthropology from Harvard University and have taught in interdisciplinary programs at Harvard University and the University of Chicago. I've used this academic background in the course of my investigative journalism, and it is primarily as an investigative journalist with a special interest in education issues that I testify today, having traced the intellectual background of the College Board's controversial new AP US History framework. I should add that a number of the interdisciplinary influences on the College Board's new history framework stem from intellectual currents which were central to my anthropological training, such as the emphasis on transnational cultural flows. Also, when I jointly taught a course in the classics of social and political theory at Harvard's Committee on Degrees in Social Studies, I was asked to present a lecture on Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Proceeding now to the nub of the issue, I believe we are here today because the College Board has made a decision to fundamentally transform the teaching of American history. In the past, teachers were simply given a brief 5-page list of topics to cover for the test. The great advantage of this method is that it allowed teachers to present American history from a wide range of perspectives. Teachers could take a traditionalist or a modern approach, a conservative or a liberal approach, or anything in between, and still see their students do well on the test. Now all of that has changed, and that is why we are here. Now, instead of a brief 5-page topical outline, the College Board has issued 80 pages of detailed guidance. The important point is not simply that the new framework is much longer than the old topical outline, but that the framework now seeks to control how teachers and students ought to think about American history. Instead of simply telling teachers what topics to cover, the College Board is telling them how to treat and present those topics. The token amount of flexibility that remains for teachers is only flexibility within sharp and deeply controversial lines that have already been drawn by the College Board. It's true, as the College Board says, that the new framework has been shaped by contemporary scholarly perspectives on major issues in U.S. history. The problem is a great deal of contemporary scholarship on American history is driven by a political agenda. This new, sharply revisionist and highly politicized scholarly agenda seeks to de-emphasize America's national story and to focus instead on global developments. This new historical revisionism is also far more focused on recounting injustices, real and alleged, of American history than on explaining or exploring our founding principles. This new historical revisionism focuses on themes of race, gender, class, and ethnicity, not merely in addition to, but at the expense of, a focus on America's unique qualities or on the principles required for responsible citizenship in a constitutional republic. To allow this framework to stand would effectively be to surrender democratic control over what Georgia's children are taught to politicized and frankly sharply left-leaning academics who dominate America's colleges and universities today. If you doubt that the state of affairs in America's history departments is as bad as all that, I would urge you to consult an article published this very week by one of our most esteemed American historians, Gordon Wood, in the Weekly Standard. A generally liberal-leaning historian, respected by conservatives and liberals alike, Wood says that the new generation of American historians is literally, quote, no longer interested in how the United States came to be, end quote. He calls them, quote, moral critics who denounce the values of the past in order to somehow reform our present, end quote. So far focused are these scholars on, quote, isolating and recovering stories of the dispossessed, end quote, such as injustices to the Indians, the slaves, and to women, says Wood, that they, quote, have difficulty writing any coherent national narrative at all, one that would account for how the United States as a whole came into being, end quote, and in any case avoid doing so for fear of bolstering patriotic sentiment. Sadly, every one of these problems affects the College Board's new AP US History framework. The framework de-emphasizes or completely eliminates themes like the intellectual background of our constitutional system, the principles of the free enterprise system, the unique role of faith traditions in American society as opposed to more secular European societies, and America's emphasis on state and local governments within a federalist system in contrast to the more centralized states of Europe. All of these things are part of what is sometimes called American exceptionalism, the qualities that make America distinctive and, yes, admirable as a country. In their place, the framework repeatedly emphasizes the injustices of American history and the clashing interests of race, class, gender, and ethnicity. The framework's insistence on framing itself around a global Atlantic world seems at times almost to obliterate America as the subject of its own history. And let me emphasize that the connection between these scholarly approaches and the framework is very direct. This is where you can consult with the two pieces you have in your folder that I've written investigating the intellectual background of the framework. One is called How the College Board Politicized U.S. History, and the other is called Why the College Board Demoted the Founders. Can the framework be fixed? I don't believe it can be. First, the College Board has undermined trust by publishing such an ideologically slanted document in the first place. But there's more to it than that. While America very much needs a unifying national narrative, one of the secrets of this country's success is the way we accommodate difference by allowing for choice. We are a very polarized country right now, both politically and culturally. It's gotten to the point where we can't even decide whether to call our foes Islamist terrorists or violent extremists. Why then should we expect to see a single national framework for the teaching of advanced U.S. history? Now that the College Board has decided to take such a heavy hand in what are, if in effect, curriculum decisions properly left to the states, it is on the verge of turning into a national school board. By issuing detailed guidelines for every single AP test, the College Board is effectively making an end run around our federalist system. AP US History is only the beginning. Soon the College Board is going to create detailed frameworks for U.S. government and politics, European history, and many more. Soon it will be unaccountable and highly politicized professors at universities far outside of Georgia who will in effect be making decisions about education that ought by rights to be in the hands of the voters of Georgia and their representatives. The solution, I suggest, is for states dissatisfied with the College Board's new history framework to explore testing alternatives, exactly as the resolution before you proposes. While it would be premature to go into details, there are already efforts underway to create such alternatives, and I believe those efforts will come to maturity within the next 1 to 2 years. It's time for Georgia and other states that may not share the ideological biases of the College Board's new framework to explore alternatives, a move which could help open up choice for states across the country. Of course, the College Board will say that Georgia's students benefit from the college credit and the application credential provided by its AP testing program, and so they do. But why should the College Board be allowed to use its current position as an AP testing monopoly to force states to buy into an ideologically biased curriculum? Explore alternative testing options, and you could get the very same benefits without being forced to carry the unwelcome ideological baggage. There is good reason to believe that this issue is not about to disappear. Quite the contrary. I believe that the controversy over the College Board's AP history changes and over the changes the College Board is about to make to all of its AP tests is only going to grow. The new history framework was sprung on the public with virtually no real notice. That left critics with little time to mobilize. But now the process is well underway. I believe you're going to see a great many scholars and public figures coming out publicly in opposition to the new framework in the coming months and years. And as the College Board issues new frameworks for all of its other tests, I believe the movement of opposition will grow. So expect to see more, rather than fewer, of your constituents up in arms about this issue in the future. Now let me take up a critically important issue heretofore.
You've got about 20 seconds.
I'm going to be showing you some material from the new textbook that conforms to the framework. Very disturbing material that shows exactly what the students will be taught and what they will learn based on the framework.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question for
Hang on a
Ms.
minute.
Yes.
They're going to pose the question
That-
first to College Board. College Board will answer. When their questions are exhausted, then you and Representative Dudgeon will pose questions.
Can you repeat that in the mic, what you just said?
Sure. The protocol will be Mr. Kurtz and Mr. Krieger. What? No, that wasn't what we said we were going to do. If
I'm just going to put some stuff on standards on the board and ask them both to respond.
they were going to ask the questions, and then y'all were going to ask the questions that you had from the Senate in the House.
Okay. Well, here's a bit.
Are they ready to? Are they prepared to ask the questions?
I told them we were after we talked about it. I thought we were going to do it. He's ready to ask questions too.
Pardon?
Yeah, I thought we were going to ask questions, Lindsay.
Well, that's fine. He said. Trevor, did I understand you correctly that you said that you would prefer the questions to come from the Senate and the House, or do you?
I believe that the purpose of a hearing should be for us to hear questions from the legislators here in the room.
Yeah. So, and we had our questions. We worked on it. Mike and I worked on it.
I don't have any problem with that, but
Okay.
well, I do have a problem with it because I want College Board to respond to it.
Yeah, and they will.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't want a long drawn out back and
No.
forth on this thing. This thing's going to stay controlled.
Sure.
We'll start it this way and see. This is not what I had in mind, and I may have communicated wrongly. If I did, I'm sorry because it. But I do want an orderly dialogue.
Sure.
Senator Ligon, if you would ask the first question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this picks up on something that Mr. Hoagie said about flexibility, and I would like to ask Mr. Krieger, but before you do, would you tell us a little bit about yourself so that we
I
know?
want College Board to answer the
Okay.
questions about the framework.
Okay, about the framework, that there's flexibility within the framework.
Yes.
Would you, I guess, repeat your statement that you'd made on that, or address that, or why you feel there's flexibility within the framework?
Yes, absolutely. The way I understand the framework is that it is just that, a framework for the actual material to be plugged in through illustrative examples. So we're given guidelines, and then I'm free to choose as a teacher, as a professional, but also most importantly based on the Georgia performance standards, what material to use to prove the arguments or to disprove the arguments that are set forth in the framework.
Okay. If you'd tell us about yourself first, and then.
Well,
My
wait a
name is
minute now.
Larry Krieger. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I've taught since 1970. I began my teaching career at Olympic High School in Charlotte, North Carolina. I spent the next 35 years teaching in the public schools of North Carolina and New Jersey. I haven't stopped teaching. I retired, but my wife says I teach more now than ever before. Quite a large number of kids that I teach almost every day. I have written a number of books, including textbooks on U.S. history and world history, and I have written a number of
If I
prep
could
books.
get you to go ahead and answer the question.
Yes,
We want
I'll
to
be
keep this
happy to
on
do
target.
that.
Thank you.
I'm concerned about your students and the flexibility myth. I really and truly am. Now, let's take a look at the actual test that your students are going to take in May. Does this test provide for that flexibility? Now, it begins, as you know, with 55 multiple choice questions worth 40% of the test. During the summer, the College Board gave each teacher at its workshops a very substantial book. It was impressive, 600 and some odd pages. And it has a chapter instructing the teachers how to write multiple choice questions for the exam. And on 4 specific places, from page 31 to 35 or so, it says, and I quote, each multiple choice item must measure information that is contained in the concept outline. Doesn't sound like a lot of flexibility to me. Now there's 40% right there. Multiple choice questions, everybody, are fixed answers.
Sir, I want to hold this to a question and an answer format. And I'm going to be honest with you. My understanding was that you two gentlemen would be asking the questions. Y'all would be responding to it. I have no problem if the Senate and the House answer the questions. But I want the questions asked and I want the questions answered. And I want it in that format. I don't want to go on in a long dialogue.
I'll give you a 2-sentence answer. An analysis of the test will clearly reveal that there's limited flexibility based upon the type of questions that are on the test and the weight that's given to them. I would estimate that at most 20% of the test will allow for flexibility. 80% will not. And keep in mind that 2/3 right on all previous AP tests would equal a 5. So students who do the framework, study the framework, can do just fine on this test, and flexibility is in fact a myth. I'm sorry, but it is.
Okay.
Would y'all like to respond to that?
Would you like us to respond to that?
Sure.
I
Okay.
would know.
What would be most helpful? We could look at the old test questions compared to the new questions, and you could judge for yourselves whether teachers now have more flexibility. I've got those both in your packet if you'd like to look at them. We could have Mr. Hoagie talk about whether the new questions give him more flexibility. What would be most helpful to you?
Just
If you can direct us to a page.
Great. So why don't you look at in the blue packet on the right folder, you'll see some slides. We'll just show you some before and after questions. You can judge for yourself whether these give your teachers more flexibility and pay more respect to your state's fine standards. Look on page 4. You'll see on page 4, the old AP US history, as Mr. Krieger has said, had a very short statement. It was a short framework. And for civil rights, it simply said expanding movements for civil rights. But then guess what question showed up on the AP test? What if your teacher chose to focus on the Greensboro 4? What if your teacher chose to focus on Selma or Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks? Look at the question that showed up on the old AP exam. The question about civil rights was, the National Organization for Women was founded in 1966 in order to, you'll see that old multiple choice section, which had many more multiple choice questions than are on the new exam, did not provide teachers flexibility. It put pressure on your teachers to cover all sorts of stuff that was in other states' standards. What we've done with the new framework is attempted to establish a national consensus around what is required for college credit. We've deliberately not put names into the framework, by and large, because we want teachers to use their state standards to fill in the names. Look at the new, just flip over to page 5 and you'll see the new AP test question by comparison, a sample new question. We've reduced the number of multiple choice questions. Now we have a longer outline, as you can see on page 5. Seeking to fulfill Reconstruction era promises, civil rights activists and political leaders achieved some legal and political successes in ending segregation, although progress toward equality was slow and halting. The new exam question gives teachers the flexibility and the students to get points for the example their teachers chose. Briefly explain one specific example of civil rights activism that curtailed segregation between 1945 and 1980. If you flip the page to page 6, you see it on the old exam, your students had to answer questions about Massachusetts policy. Page 6, the topic in the framework was colonial government, but who knew? What would show up on the AP exam? A test question about Massachusetts education policy. You can see on page 7, the new AP exam. A longer description for the teachers. They can then use their state standards to populate that content. And the test question says, briefly describe one factor that enabled the New England colonies to develop a thriving economy. Now, I agree with Mr. Krieger. I agree with Mr. Krieger that multiple choice questions do require one correct response. And so we need to ensure that this framework is free of ideological bias. I agree fully with Professor Kurtz as well. An AP framework has no business being ideologically biased in any way. So we want feedback during this public review process that will help us ensure that there is no bias in that framework. We've already heard some really great examples that we can commit to change already. We're eager for the public review period to complete on February 28th so that we can make these changes. I'll stop there.
That's fine. Representative Dudgeon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. For the record, I have a child in AP US history right now. And when I asked his teacher what he thought of the new framework, he said it was too left for me. I don't look at, we can pull cherry-picked examples, and we need to talk about some because they're important. I actually have one. But if you read, when I first heard about this rhubarb, I read the framework myself, and I came across thinking that it was too leftist. And it seems to be imbued with identity group politics, which is sort of the modern leftist worldview, which if that was part of the thing, that's fine, but it seems to be imbibed in the entire thread of U.S. history. And, you know, here's a perfect example for talking about the Industrial Revolution. International and internal migrations increased both urban and rural populations, but gender, racial, ethnic, religious, and socioeconomic inequalities abounded, inspiring reformers' attempt to address inequalities. There was reform during that time, but you see that kind of phraseology just all over and over and over in the framework. And since the old framework was much shorter, as you said, for the College Board, how do I not interpret that as you're trying to put that sort of ideology as a sort of the background message for all of AP U.S. history?
The statement I've heard Mr. Krieger make that I agree with is that when you go from short terms like civil rights movement towards a sentence, it is very easy for words to be misused in ways that would create some sense of bias. I agree with that concern. And as I've said, the College Board's objective is to ensure that there is none of that there. A prime example is the statement about Reagan, right? There's a statement that the committee felt that they were really doing a great job of trying to show off how many different strategies and approaches Reagan implemented to address the Cold War. They felt that, if anything, they were being too aggressive in promoting him as a hero. That said, when the public saw this framework and they saw that term that he used, bellicose rhetoric, many people in the public felt that that term bellicose was a pejorative and that undercut Reagan's accomplishments. Because that was not our intent, we have already agreed to make that change. We will replace that word bellicose with assertive rhetoric that threatened military action. So there are things like that, and I think the example you've given is a good one as well, that we need to be very clear that in the importance of identifying racial and ethnic conflict within American history, and we would all agree that that is essential. One of the problems of the old framework is that there was not a single minority or female mentioned in the entire old framework, right? So we don't want to go back to that, but we need to ensure that that is not the dominant theme of American history, because there are other equally essential strands. So that is something we'll be taking a close look at during this review period.
I want to mention this to the other senators. The first series of questions I want to come from Senator Ligon and Representative Dudgeon. We will have time for other senators to pose questions. Is that okay? Okay.
Am I allowed to respond to that last one, or are we not doing it that way?
No, sir. Okay. Thank you. If you want to follow up, on that, you can.
Okay. Yeah, I would like to ask, in your learned scholarly opinion, do you think that the new framework has that theme imbued into it or imbibed into it?
I definitely do. And again, as you say, I don't think there are any problems mentioning the downside for various groups of the Industrial Revolution, but what we don't see is an adequate emphasis on the positives that drew all the immigrants there in the first place. And that gets us back to the flexibility issue. You can fill in the name, you can fill in an example, but if it's in a name and an example illustrating a biased concept to begin with, then that's not really flexibility. It's only flexibility for how to come up with the idea that the College Board wants you to come up with. Because what they're doing is giving us new concepts. How do we think about the Industrial Revolution and immigration? Well, we think about it as causing all of these problems for various minority groups. So, and I just don't see how this can be fixed by a little tweak with President Reagan. The concepts and themes of the framework are very particular. They pervade the whole framework. And as I said in my opening remarks, we don't have agreement and we'll never have agreement on exactly how to teach American history. So what we need to have is choice. States and districts need to have choice of more than one testing company. Shouldn't be a monopoly, because what satisfies one state is not going to satisfy another.
Senator Leggett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The framework is broken down. It starts with these thematic learning objectives, and there are 7 within the framework. And I'd like to go to slide 2, which actually compares the theme under identity from the 2014 framework to the 2007 framework. Those are the 7 themes that are in the framework now. But if we go to the next slide, and I would like to I mean, as you read those, you see that there's a distinct difference when we're talking about the American identity. And in the 2000 framework, we were reviewing American national character and ideas about American exceptionalism. That seems to be absent from the 2014 framework, and the emphasis seems to be on the formation of gender, class, racial, and ethnic studies. And so I would like to ask both sides of the panel to respond to this and to tell us about the significance of the difference now that we don't seem to be focusing on American exceptionalism, and maybe even tell us what that concept means. So, go ahead.
Sure. If you turn to page 10 of the slides, we'd like your feedback on this, because we're absolutely happy to restore the term American exceptionalism to the framework, but I want you to see why it was removed. I just want you to have some information so that you can advise us appropriately. Again, we have no concerns about restoring that term. That term was removed from the framework. It used to say, as that slide says, that the students should study ideas about American exceptionalism. What that frequently turned into in the classroom, if you do a Google search for American exceptionalism, you'll see all sorts of articles tracing the term back to communists in the 1920s, talking about how negative America is. So our committee thought, we don't want students memorizing a term. We want students to actually study examples of American exceptionalism. So you can see on page 10 the changes we made. The old AP US History simply said ideas about American exceptionalism. The new AP US History, you can see the list of statements that are now in the framework. I hear claims, as you've heard today, that the framework is relentlessly negative. That simply is not what I see in the framework, or what the American Historical Association sees, or the Organization of American Historians. It is not negative to claim that the United States developed the world's first modern mass democracy. It is not negative to claim that America's establishment of ideals of self-government and personal liberty served as inspiration for the rest of the world. These things are American exceptionalism. We want these things. Our committee felt it was more appropriate to make sure that there was clarity about examples of American exceptionalism than simply to insert the term. But that said, we're happy to reinstate the term if our stakeholders feel that would be helpful.
Mr. Kurtz.
Sure.
Dr. Kurtz.
Well, reinserting the term isn't going to help. No, there is no American exceptionalism in this framework, despite that very brief mention. What is American exceptionalism? Go back to Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1830s, a Frenchman who came to the United States and was so struck by what made America different from Europe. He noticed not only the first successful representative democracy, but a deep culture of democracy where the ideals of liberty and equality were affecting people's basic attitudes about whether they could succeed, about whether to defer to other people. He noticed a respect for the free enterprise system. In Europe, it was actually thought shameful to be involved in business and trying to change your social station. He noticed religion. Tocqueville came from a place where the advocates of democracy hated religion, because in the French Revolution, the church and the state were leagued together, and the Democrats were secularists. Here, Tocqueville was shocked when he came to America, and he saw priests who were supporting democracy, and he saw the people in general felt that religion was not only compatible, but was necessary to support democracy. He saw New England town meetings, whereas in France, the central government told the local mayors what to do. Tocqueville was shocked to see people in New England town meetings running their own affairs directly and democratically. And by the way, they ran their schools. And Tocqueville said this is the bulwark of individual liberty. These concepts are not in the framework. We're getting the race, gender, ethnic, class instead. American exceptionalism, as classically understood, is not in it. And to put it in, you really couldn't have the same framework. That's why there needs to be more than one testing alternative for states to choose from.
Any other response?
Yeah, let's hear from an AP teacher to see if
Sure.
he sees American exceptionalism in the framework, and if the framework has in any way reduced his teaching of American exceptionalism.
The first thing I'd like to point out is when I read SR 80, I sort of wanted to do a little exercise with my students to see if they were getting an anti-patriotic education from my perspective and from the perspective of the framework. So I asked a few students to come and spend their lunch period with me, and I gave them a copy of the framework in a red and a green pen, and I asked them to highlight everything in red that they thought was, derogatory towards the United States, things that they would be ashamed of as an American, and I asked them to underline everything in green that they felt they could be proud of as an American. And what the result was is that a fairly balanced approach with a lean towards the green. There was more green ink on that paper than there was red. The students' perspective is that it's a balanced framework and that overall they're proud to be Americans. Having sat in my class for 5 months with me teaching the framework, I teach American exceptionalism from day one. It's my first lesson. So I've taught it throughout the semester. So I see it in the framework.
Representative Dudgeon, and let me make a clarification on time. I think we're going to lose some of the House members at 2. They have to go to a DOT election, and what I'm going to do is at 2 I will take some questions from the senators and representatives after they leave. I'll start with Senator Sims and then Senator Millar, and then the rest of you that have a question.
I have an overarching question I think is very important. College Board is trying to represent a college history class, and I think it is pretty much common knowledge that that academia is dominated by a leftist ideology, and if you do surveys of professors are 90-something%, and a lot of the extreme rhetoric coming out of academia is the left. So how does a College Board reconcile making a test that's a college test when probably the vast majority of college U.S. history classes are taught well to the left of the average American? How can you reconcile that with creating a balanced framework?
Sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think that's such a great question, and it's the exact task we've set for ourselves, because we've had the same concern, that without a framework that is more specific than that old 5-page one, it was very easy for AP test questions to show up that did not represent a balanced approach to American history. If you look on page 18, you'll see we did a blind study of the 2 exams, the old AP exam and the new exam, and had conservative reviewers look at them without knowing which one was the old exam and which one was the new exam. You can see their reaction on page 18. When we compared the old and new AP US history exams, we were surprised that the new exam actually felt more politically balanced. The subjects in the old exams certainly lean left politically, and Mr. Krieger's own materials sort of have pointed this out. While he hasn't advocated himself that the exam should be leftist by any means, his materials have acknowledged that those old exams leaned left. The focus on unions, the women's movement, minority issues, and environmental concerns clearly created an agenda within the old exam, whereas the new exam is more favorable toward America. References to the Civil War generally negative on the old exam, but positive in the new exam. There's an increased focus on objective facts rather than questions that appear simply designed to trip up students. So this is what we've attempted to do with this framework, to signal that we will not allow exam questions to be placed on an AP exam any longer unless we have signaled to the public that they represent a balanced concept. And that's the reason why we wanted to put in front of the public a more detailed concept outline. Rather than keeping that information confidential, we wanted to reveal that to the public and put pressure on all of us to ensure that it's balanced. Again, I accept the feedback. If there are concerns about it not yet being balanced, we want to know that. But it's not very helpful for us to hear just broad-based claims that it's all negative or all ideologically balanced. Or ideologically imbalanced.
I'll be glad to go through my slideshow with you in just a second.
We want that feedback.
Sure.
We want that.
But Mr. Krieger, would you?
I'm on page 18, and let me preface it by saying I appreciate the conciliatory tone that Mr. Packer has presented thus far. So, Mr. Packer, I know you're familiar with the exams, reference to, for example, the Civil War, generally negative on the old exam. I have all the old exams right here, but positive in the new exam. Now, I'm unaware of any question on the Civil War on the new exam, and on the old one,
It's a typo. You're right. It's a good catch from Mr. Krieger. It's a typo. It should say the Cold War. References to the Cold War were generally negative on the old exam and not on the new.
Okay. On the Cold War,
Yeah, that was one of my questions.
I'm not so sure of that. I have retyped every single released AP question, and the Cold War was covered, but I don't really see that as generally negative. You'd have to explain that. And on the new one, I'm going through my mind right now for a Cold War. Well, I guess you had the Truman and Reagan paired quotes, so okay for that.
And this is not this is a quote I'm sharing with you. I'm not here to defend that. I'm sharing with you one perspective.
Mr. Kurtz.
I'd like to say something about this focus on the, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
this focus on the new exam. The new exam is one exam. It's a sample exam. They're going to be exam after exam turned out. It's the framework that controls. And I can't help, I'm not a mind reader, but I can't help but feel as though the College Board understands perfectly well that this is a new framework, that many schools haven't yet been able to purchase framework-compliant textbooks, that many teachers are not used to the framework. I think this is only the beginning of a process in which the framework is going to become ever more reflected in future exams. The framework controls, and to look at an early exam put out at a point when the College Board knew there would be controversy is perhaps more misleading than to look at the framework itself.
And I'd like for us to stick with the framework because that's what we're looking at.
Okay, I will, did you have another question, Mike, before you left?
We gave him one more. Let me prepare my last question.
You want me to go on?
I'll get one more.
Okay. Well, I guess since we're talking about the themes,
Stay on the framework if you can.
yeah, well, on the framework and the themes, the 7 themes, is there anything missing from the themes?
Well, there are a few themes that are missing. Dr. Ketchum reviewed the framework for the Pioneer Institute, and he raised the issue of, well, where is federalism as a theme? Federalism, from a political point of view, is one of the most important themes in American history. It certainly dominated the period before the Civil War. That's what the issue was all about between the states, the southern states, and the government in Washington. Also, individual rights would be another really good theme to focus on. And I'm sure Dr. Kurtz has a few more examples.
Sure, I could throw in other examples such as I mentioned before. There could have been a thematic framework on faith traditions and how they interact with American culture. But the larger point is there isn't only one way to go. There isn't only one set of themes that is the set of themes. The College Board has made a choice. That choice reflects a certain perspective. And again, we'll never have complete consensus on how to teach American history. So should there only be one set of themes from one company and one test, shouldn't we have a variety of testing companies, each of which churns out a framework? And getting back to the point about the scholars, the connection with the scholars are overwhelmingly and predominantly leftist, but there are some very fine scholars that run against the grain. And I, without going into too much detail, I predict to you that some very fine, more traditionally oriented scholars would be advising a competing company should such a company emerge and be created, and you would see a very different set of themes on a framework that they would develop, and that would create real choice.
Representative Dodger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know there's been some criticism about a lack of omission. You addressed that. You're not trying to de-emphasize the founding fathers, not leaving out Martin Luther King, things of that nature. But to my teacher friend there, I mean, different teachers approach things differently, but a lot of teachers are going to look at this framework and say, there's a tremendous amount of pressure on AP for the kids to make a 3 or above on the test. I mean, that is a huge pressure on those AP teachers. In fact, in Georgia, the CCRPI has bonus points for AP credit. And in my school, we have a ton of AP considerations, and I know how the teachers are looking at that test. So they're going to look, I think, at this framework to say, all right, I'm going to look in here for clues for what's going to be on my test. And so even though you say, okay, we're leaving this flexibility, there's examples of different people and topics are kind of sprinkled in as it says teachers have flexibility to use examples such as the following, blah, blah, blah. But I'm concerned that the framework, by calling out certain ones as examples, you're really leading the teachers into emphasizing those and then maybe leaving out a lot about the Founding Fathers. I know I asked my son when he went through the time on the Founding Fathers. I've been watching them. I've been had an active experiment going on in my house. And in my opinion, the amount of time spent on that part of such a critical part of American history was just way too short. And I think if you lead how the framework faces, so I guess two questions. Is there enough time in the framework for the founding period of this country, which is just so critical to the American identity and American exceptionalism, and I think is so important? It seems like it's just very shortly covered in the framework. And then two, how do you ask and I have to do both of these because I have to go to my DOT vote, but how do you answer the question of these specific examples? I know you say the teachers have the flexibility, but if I'm the teacher saying, I want to know what's on the test, I'm going to pick what's in this document. So two questions for the AP folks.
And maybe I'll take the lead and then to you, Mr. Hoagie. We agree that one of the great enemies to students developing a love for our country's founding is a rush through history. And we hear of history teachers saying, you know, in European history, I've got to kill Napoleon by Christmas, or else I won't get through things before the test. And we have worried about a similar rush through the founding of our country. We've been heartened to see teachers respond to the new framework and say that it gives them much more time. Our piloting of the framework said that the teachers freed up 21 additional class periods to focus on local priorities with the new framework versus the old, and their satisfaction level went from 24% up to 81% in terms of saying that the framework gives them the right balance of topics and flexibility. So 24 to 81 is a huge jump. We see no evidence from teachers that we should go back to the old framework. We want that 81 to be even higher. How is this playing out with you in your classroom?
Well, to give you some practical sort of examples, last year under the old outline, I made it to Reagan. That was the best I could do, and it was a dead run to Reagan, because I felt like there was just so many discrete facts that my students had to know. Because I basically had to use the released exams to determine what I had to teach, because the old outline was so vague, I turned to the released exams. Because as you said, I mean, my job is to get 3s, 4s, and 5s. Mm-hmm. So I went to the released exams and used that as clues, because the outline, when I looked at the outline, I was like, what am I going to do with this? This only gives me a vague idea of what's tested. So then it ended up that I was trying to do this exhaustive teaching of every person, every piece of legislation, every Supreme Court case. And what it became was a recitation of facts. And the students who got 3s, 4s, and 5s were the students who were best at memorizing facts. And it wasn't an analysis. It wasn't interpretation. And I feel the new curriculum allows, the new framework, I should say, allows the students to slow down, to interpret, to analyze. And one thing I'd like to point out is that I may be misspeaking here, but I believe the rubric for the free response essays allows students to support, refute, or modify, which if a teacher teaches something contrary to the framework, I believe the student will still be rewarded if he can support it with historical evidence. That's my understanding, at least.
Dr.
Can we hear the other opinion on that? Thank you.
Yes. I mean, to me, that is a self-refuting point. Are you seriously going to tell students to argue with the framework, students who are desperate to get a 3? Are you seriously going to tell teachers that they should teach against the framework? Maybe a few very courageous and experienced souls will. But to give a set of concepts and then say, oh, sure, if you dare to challenge this, we'll give you a good grade too. No one is going to take that risk. And the flexibility that has been purchased by reducing the number of facts that need to be memorized, the cost of that is that the concepts have come down from on high. So whatever extra time you get, you've got to teach the students that concept and that analysis that's in the framework. So we've gone from a list of facts which teachers could teach with whatever concepts they want to a list of concepts which inevitably is going to represent some particular perspective that some people will like and some people won't. That's why we're having an argument, because once you get off the facts, people aren't going to come to an agreement. That's where you need variety. That's where you need choice.
I have a couple of questions. One for Mr. Packer. I've wondered.
Hang on a minute. Let me take some questions from the senators, if you don't mind. Senator Sims.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm trying to understand what it is you guys want. My first question is, how do you propose, and this is serious, how do you propose to remove academic bias from public schools? That's number one. Number two, in your quest to eliminate, sirs, gentlemen, from AP studies, ethnic groups, including the American Indians that own most of the territory before the Pilgrims arrived, you want to eliminate ethnic groups and women in history. Explain that to me, because you continue to say this is left-leaning material. So are you trying to eradicate the entire framework? You don't want any of this material taught, or is it it's not representing what are you going right or left or center? What are you trying to get? Tell us.
That is a great question. I absolutely do not want to eliminate teaching about slavery, teaching about the treatment of the American Indians, teaching about the civil rights movement. All of that is vitally important. All of that has to be included. My strong feeling is that that has risen to the point of replacing these other core emphases. I want to restore what I consider to be balance. Now, how do we propose to create an unbiased essay? Once you start talking about concepts, you can't do that, and that's why I say we need
But my
choice.
question is this.
Yes.
Having been an American history teacher years and years ago, the first thing that was told to me by a superintendent was, we don't teach nothing about Africa. And that's exactly the way she told me. So is that what you're trying to do? I mean, tell me what you want.
By the way, as I said at the beginning, I'm a social anthropologist. I did my work in India. My academic book is about religion and family life in India.
But we're talking about American
Right, absolutely.
history.
But I'm just
Yes,
trying
sir.
to say I'm hardly against learning about other cultures and societies. I'm all for world history, and I'm all for studying the difficult experiences that many minority groups have experienced within the United States. It's a question of how to balance that. By the way, I have read the work of scholars who influenced the framework, and they commented negatively on many of the state standards, which they considered included. They were frustrated by the fact that the state standards included so many facts to be memorized, and they complained about the fact that minority groups and the Indians and all of that were just added on. And they said what we really want is to change the concept of how history as a whole is being taught. And so we don't just want issues of minorities to be added on. They want something more. That's what's really going on here. These scholars want to change in a deep way the way we conceptualize history. So there is a balance to be struck between the good and the bad, between the narrative of the nation of a whole and of various groups. And everyone, once you get to concepts, everyone will strike that balance differently. And then I think we need a smorgasbord of options for states to choose from. One company that holds a monopoly on this kind of testing is never going to satisfy everyone on how to balance all of those elements.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Sims. Senator Miller.
You know, this is very interesting to me because I'm actually a proponent for Common Core. A lot of people in the room aren't. And yet, and I'm just a layperson, okay? And I looked at that sample exam, read it, and read some of the questions. Remember the immigrants' picture, and the answer to their salvation was the federal government. It had nothing to do with free market or capitalism. Now, bear with me. Let me finish, okay? Went to a meeting, which you were at. Now, again, I appreciate your willingness to do this. Where you said basically that, well, it's better than it used to be. And it seems to me that we've got a major problem here when you got people, a Common Core person sitting here telling you, no, I just think the old Clint Eastwood movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, there seems to be an awful lot of the bad and the ugly from what I'm looking at versus the good. And the perspective that's taken on this thing. Now, this needs to be fixed. You're not just going to hear from this in Georgia. I can assure you, you know, I'm part of the Southern Regional Education Board, so is Lindsay, some other people in this room. People are talking about this throughout that organization. It's gone too far the other way. Now, you can just changing a word here or there isn't the answer. Now, Dr. Kurtz is a lot smarter than I am, but he pretty well summed it up from a standpoint of as a layperson, as a voter, as a parent or grandparent, that this thing has gone too tilted, and there's nothing wrong with what I'll call the social justice issues. But there just seems to be such an overkill that way versus the federalism, versus the kind of points these gentlemen are talking about. Now, and again, you all said you're going to try to fix this. You've got a monopoly, just like Sachs has with our schools. And what this gentleman's saying, well, maybe you shouldn't have the monopoly. I'm thinking more about all those students who take AP history to get credit. That's who I'm worried about, okay? But I want to make sure that they're getting a balanced viewpoint. And I just don't see that. We can sit here and change this word or that word. But as William pointed out to you, Senator Ligon, okay, there's a big difference in 2007, 2014 as a layperson. I'm just a layperson, okay? I'm not a professional educator. But again, I just wonder how serious you're going to be. When are you going to come back? What's going to be done to fix this from the perspective of people? That's my question. When's it going to happen? Because I know educators have a tendency to go on and on and on, and nothing ever happens.
So the question sounds like it's about the timeline. What is the timeline for the College Board's implementation of changes based on the public review process?
That's the essence of it. And is there going to be a shift? Is there going to be a shift based upon the input you're getting from the various people in the various states?
So the timeline is the public review period ends on February 28th. We'll then assemble all of that feedback. We'll present it to a committee of professors and teachers that will meet throughout the months of March, April, and May. We'll then send this through an editorial sort of design and layout process to do the graphic design of the new framework, the sort of mechanics, the operations of it, and then we'll release it to the public in July. Yes, we will make substantive changes for incorporating any feedback that identifies intentional or unintentional ideological bias, because our objective is the same as yours, to have a framework that provides teachers with the flexibility that Mr. Hoagie has and many other teachers like him have claimed they now have, but that does not in any way put pressure on teachers to slant their course to the left or to the right. Our perspective is that the College Board's framework should not have any ideological bias. It sounds like Mr. Kurtz does not agree that any framework can ever do that states concepts. And that's fine. He is welcome to take the position that it is impossible to ever have a framework. The College Board does not believe this is impossible. We are partnered with the American Historical Association, the Organization of American Historians, the National Council of History Educators. We have the leading historical organizations in the country backing this. We will make further changes, but I do not agree that it is relentlessly negative. Look at page 10. You tell me which is better. One reference to American exceptionalism, 7 references to positive elements of the founding of our country. So I'm not on the same page that this is a relentlessly negative document. I do think improvements need to be made, and we're committed to that.
One final question then. If you brought in a group of parents, not educators, and had them look at this, if you all really want to know what people think versus just legislators, just other educators, bring in a group of parents, like Representative Dudgeon said to you, okay? Sit down with a group of parents. Do that in various states after they look through this and get their input. Because, at the end of the day, that's probably who really matters, because it's their kids. And I tell you right now, in reading through this, when I look through the practice exam, okay, and you told me it's better than it used to be because you never gave it out before. That's not the way I remember the world, and that's not minimizing the ugly either. I just thought it was too much. I'm just telling you as a layperson, I thought it was too much, and we'll see what y'all end up doing. But what's going to happen, unfortunately, okay, what this gentleman just said to you, you're going to say, well, this is what we got to go with, and there's a monopoly, and we can't do anything about it. Well, maybe you better start looking for alternatives. That's not a threat. That's just reality. So I think you all have to be prepared for that.
Well, we're not concerned about that, and I would argue that we do not have a monopoly. But right?
Yeah, can I just speak for a moment on that? Because you come back to that several times. I teach in a high school. I lose kids to joint enrollment every day. They do not have a monopoly. Students can choose to go and do joint enrollment and earn college credit. We lose them to Kennesaw State. I have a wonderful student that I lost to West Georgia. Yeah. So I don't see a monopoly here. They don't have to take the course. I beg them to take the course, but they choose not to. Their parents choose not to take it. There is no
And we think the
monopoly.
pressure you all
There
described
is
No,
is
you
helpful.
misunderstood what I said. When I said monopoly, they're the only game in town to get 3, 4, and 5. That's called a monopoly.
But college credit can come from joint enrollment.
Well, I understand that, okay? But I thought we'd like to try to give every child who could the opportunity if they want to take AP history and were qualified. But if there's only one game in town, that's called a monopoly.
I mean, it's
Even I know that from my background.
I mean, the College Board emphasizes how many benefits come to parents from the college credit they get.
Correct.
There needs to be an alternative test that gives exactly the same kind of benefits, and we really don't have that now. And if you take a now, I'm guessing the colleges down here in Georgia are better, according to my taste, than some others, but I worry about the influence of the academics even with joint enrollment. I worry when I hear things like the Organization of American Historians. Have a look at this piece I wrote called How the College Board Politicized U.S. History, and you'll see that the reason, a big part of the reason the framework is the way it is because the Organization of American Historians put out something called the La Pietra Report, which was all about globalizing U.S. history, de-emphasizing the national narrative. They have consulted with the Organization of American Historians. That's why we have the problem.
I'd like to remind y'all, I want to maintain the focus of the questions on the framework as much as possible. I think that's what we're discussing is the framework, and when we get into areas of opinion, it's hard to get to a fact. Representative Setzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Packer, Mr. Hogan, panel, appreciate you being here. I wanted to commend you on one part of the framework. And when you get in the progressive era, the idea of trust busting, the idea that you've got private organizations that move in and are able to corner parts of the market, create distortions of market forces. Consumers aren't served well, employees aren't served well, and then you sort of create this distortion that we recognize late 19th century government got involved, early 20th century to kind of break that up to create better general conditions. I think the framework handles that very well. In like order, the idea of any one entity, in this case the College Board, setting the framework, consulted by a lot of organizations, and we look at the impact that trusts had in sort of bending the economics of the late 19th century. Think about, what's really in question here, and I want to get your thoughts on this, is when you're talking about setting aside kids who would choose a dual enrollment track, taking kids that are in their high schools they're going to have history taught in their high school setting. You're looking at the top 25%, maybe 30% of kids that are taking a curriculum that's in accordance with the framework. The reason there's concern, just as we talk about in the marketplace, this idea of trust, you're talking about the top 25% of American culture that is learning the whole sweep of the meaning of American history from one organization. Now, I will tell you, I wouldn't trust this legislature. I wouldn't trust my political party. I wouldn't trust another political party. I wouldn't trust any elected body to make the decision about what, over the course of a generation, 315 million Americans believe that the Constitution means. When I grew up and sort of looked at my understanding and started growing into my understanding of the Constitution, the idea of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the enumerated powers of Congress in the Constitution. I never learned that in school. That was written out of the Constitution effectively for me until I was an adult. Because nowhere in the sweep of my American history education was this idea that the federal government was formed with certain limited enumerated powers. There's other things I'm sure I missed. I think the concern I would share is just as we talk about the impact in a relatively limited sphere of trust busting in the late 19th century, isn't it true that if one organization, even if it's a consortium of groups, that have one channel through which the top 25% of all American young people, and over the course of a generation, all American adults believe our nation, what it means, what the Constitution means, and what the full sweep of history means. You've got a great organization, I'm sure. It's not a critique of you. I'm just concerned that even though the framework hits the marks you're seeking to address, it's too much authority to give any one organization the power to influence what all Americans believe, or at least what the top 25% of Americans believe. And with that in mind, I'd like your thoughts, Mr. Packer. Would you welcome a multiplicity of organizations where there could be 2 or 3 or 4 college boards to give those kinds of choices, where one organization doesn't solely influence the elite, really the leadership class of Americans?
I think this is such a good and insightful sort of discussion to have, and I really appreciate the way you framed that question. So let me give 3 quick sort of sentences as responses. I have personally shared the concern that in the old state of AP, where teachers only had this 5-page topic outline and never saw the AP exams because they were only released once every 5 to 8 years, that the concerns you've just described were amplified, right? Because who knew what this top 25% were learning if there was this very vague framework and exams that were never shared with the public? So I have felt dismayed by the sort of condemnation and castigation the College Board has received by making what I see as to have been a very responsible move. To say no longer are we going to conceal the results of our survey of thousands of American colleges. We're a membership organization, so we are a consortia of 6,000 colleges and high schools. And so we do design AP not with I'm not writing the AP course materials, my staff aren't writing them. We bring together representatives from our 6,000 members, colleges and high schools. And I felt strongly that if we did not make that information public, if we did not share with the public what these colleges and high schools are saying will be on an AP exam, we were irresponsible. So I feel like this has been a bold and appropriate move, that we would not be in this situation where we're having conversations about ensuring balance in AP US history if we had not been forthcoming with this material, because we see that as an appropriate move for us to make. Your general question, though, in terms of does the College Board think it would be healthy to have a number of organizations building high-quality academic coursework in US history so that consumers can choose? Personally, I'm always a believer in that. I believe the competition is a good thing, that it brings out the best in organizations. So I welcome that notion. It sounds like a notion that Professor Kurtz champions. But do I think that I would also ask for respect, and respect that I do not feel has been forthcoming, related to the moves the College Board has made, to recognize the responsibility we hold to do right in history classrooms. And a first and important step towards that is making available to the public the results of these surveys of colleges and universities and high schools that identify what all these institutions say they value for college credit. And that's what we've tried to do. And that's brought us to a position where it's not surprising that this, that in the first year of a framework we would recognize areas for improvement, but it is surprising the level of misrepresentation and approbation or disapprobation that has been heaped upon the College Board for what I see as an organization really doing the right thing by our stakeholders.
And again, I asked that question because, and I appreciate you being willing to say that publicly, because from Jefferson to Madison to Frederick Douglass would all say we don't need to put too much authority in any one entity. A government of men is a dangerous thing, and there need to be these appropriate balances. And I appreciate your commitment to standards. I'm not suggesting that some fly-by-night group emerge that competes with you but doesn't do a good job. I just wanted to hear that there is a recognition that having a variety of College Board-esque organizations that could provide this, that could provide states, could provide school districts some choice about this, creates conditions where I think the College Board could even be better. I would submit to you the fact that I stand for election every 2 years makes me a better representative than if I were elected for 10 years. And I think those same forces would make teachers better. I think it would allow school boards to be more engaged when there are choices. And I appreciate your public commitment.
And there are a few examples of that you should be aware of too. The International Baccalaureate Organization is the next largest after the AP program. And to give you an example of how committed we are to ensuring that there are a variety of powerful educational opportunities for students to earn college credit, we gave the IB organization office space for free in our New York offices to help them get started in America. Most people consider them a competitor to AP because they're providing fee-based opportunities to take an exam for college credit. We don't see it that way. We see them as doing a really important thing that we want to honor. Similarly, we've partnered with the Cambridge organization, which is, I think, the next largest after AP and IB among the groups that are providing credit by examination opportunities in America. So they've been a partner of ours as well. So I hope that gives you some conviction that these are not just words, these are principles that we've acted on historically.
Let's bring this back into focus. We've got 4 questions remaining, and I want to give Senator Ligon time. He would like to do look at some framework comparisons, and I'd like to see those myself. The order, I think you mashed the button. Senator Hostetler, then Chairman Rice, then Representative Belton, and Representative Tanner. Senator Hostetler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I apologize for being a few minutes late. I was in another meeting, but I thought I was coming here for a discussion about content, and I know it sort of shifted to flexibility. So my question is, are we talking about flexibility in the old and new system, or are we talking about content? But I do want to make one comment about something earlier that was said about bellicose rhetoric being thought that that was a favorable comment, a compliment. And, you know, bellicose means inclined or eager to fight, aggressively hostile, belligerent. And rhetoric is language designed to have a persuasive or impressive, often regarded as lacking in sincerity or meaningful content. So I guess my question would be, how many people in this organization believe that President Reagan is an aggressively hostile, belligerent person lacking in sincerity or meaningful content, that that's a compliment? That bothers me, and I question the sincerity of that conversation.
Yeah, so this is one that when I first reviewed the framework several years ago, I flagged it as well. I thought, wow, that feels like a little bit of a jab. So I went and asked the committee, I said, why are you using that word? They showed me that in most textbooks today, the term that is associated with Reagan's rhetoric is that phrase, bellicose rhetoric. And so I said, okay, I'll step back. If this is what the general term is that's used to describe the moves Reagan made to threaten military action, I'll step back. I feel like that was a mistake at this point, because clearly it wasn't just me that felt a little bit ruffled when I read that. The public at large has spoken there, and we'll make that change. I would not agree, though, that the committee is disingenuous in having said we meant that as our attempt was to show Reagan as a strong and assertive leader. I believe that their intent was sincere, that Reagan in the old framework isn't called out in that way. His name is just there, but there isn't attention paid to the diversity of tactics he used to address the situation America was in during that stage of the Cold War. And I do believe that the committee meant that as additional respect that hadn't been paid to Reagan in the former framework.
Mr. Kurtz?
May I address that? This, I have to say, this reminds me of our arguments over media bias. You know, a conservative will look at what they call the mainstream media and say, well, this is bias and that is bias. And then the reporters will come and say, well, we didn't really mean it that way. We were just trying to cover the facts. And I thought, from my perspective, the underlying problem there is that the reporters in question, or in the analogous case, in the question of the College Board and its academic advisors, they are so outside the framework of someone who would see that this was a problem in talking about President Reagan. They are so trusting of existing textbooks, which are also biased themselves, that it doesn't even occur to them. This is a systemic problem. It isn't just one example. It pervades the framework. The Reagan example is the scariest one, but would you go to the New Republic and say, well, that article there was a little bit too liberal. Could you just tweak it a little bit? Basically, the people at the New Republic are liberal, and the people at the National Review are conservative. The people advising the College Board generally come from one perspective, and I think we've got to get a company that has different kinds of advisors, different kinds of intellectual influences to create a real choice.
And could I get the flexibility content?
Do it.
Flexibility versus content. I didn't hear any answer on that. What are you more interested in, the flexibility of it or the content?
Larry, do you want to start?
I've been wanting to talk about flexibility versus content all night, actually.
Well, we don't want to stay all night.
I'm going to be super succinct. The flexibility argument is really the linchpin of all the College Board's defense of the framework. There's a tremendous disconnect between the framework and the Georgia standards. There are 133 specific items in the Georgia standards that aren't in the framework, and there are 60 items, including you're supposed to start your school year with the prehistory before Columbus, not American exceptionalism. And there are some 60 items, including the rigid racial hierarchy, the white superiority, the odd definition, the revisionist definition of manifest destiny. So in order to close that gap, College Board has come up with this flexibility argument, and there's never been an opportunity to fully explain to people exactly what it is. Now, I started off by saying 40% of the test is multiple choice, and there's no flexibility there. Another 25% of the test is the DBQ. That's the document-based question. The students look at 7 documents, come up with a thesis. Now, on the old test, you got points for bringing in new material. But on the new one, it is awarded 7 points. And it specifically says you're only going to get 1 point for outside information. I'm not making this up. That's what it says. Now, that would be approximately 3% of a 100-point score. So if you accept that 40% of the test is multiple choice, and that's fixed, another 25% is the DBQ, and of that, 22% is clearly contained within the question. You're now at 62%, and guess what? You can get a close to or maybe even a 5 with 62%. Now, what they keep referring to are the short answer questions that they have, and which we heard a couple examples. Those new short answer questions are only worth 20% of the test. That's it. I don't want to get too technical, but except to say that each of those questions has 3 subparts worth 1 point. So taking the most charitable interpretation, there would be 10% of the test, or half of that 20%, that would be flexible. The rest of it's not, and guess what? You get 50% right on this test, you're somewhere between the lowest possible 4 and the highest possible 3. And then finally, we've got the long essay question at the end. I have them right here. It's very debatable. Dr. Kurtz and I were discussing them this morning, just how much flexibility there is on those questions. But even if you said, okay, half of the 15% of the test for one of those questions, if you've been following me, it all adds up to about 20% for flexibility. 80% is coming from the framework. And keep in mind that 65% will get you a 5 on previous tests, surprise, and 50 to 60% will get you a 4, and 42% to roughly 50% will net you a 3. So, what Dr. Kurtz said and what I'm finding in my own instruction, and I want to preface this by saying, all of my students for the last 5 years have scored a 5. I intend to get 100% 5s this year. And to do that, I have to be pragmatic. Every one of my students has received a copy of the framework. The shortest way to a 5, if you're being purely pragmatic, and my job is to help those kids get 5s, is through the framework. You know the framework back and forward and its biases, and you are virtually assured of a 5, whether I personally agree with those biases or not. Those kids come to me, and where I teach, we want 5s. Not 4s, not 3s, not 2s. And the way to a high score is through the framework, not, and its content, not flexibility. Flexibility is, I'm sorry to tell you, a mirage.
Needless to say, we disagree with most of that comment entirely. The descriptions of the scoring of the exam were not accurate. The descriptions of the points were not accurate. But I'd like the teacher to speak to the issue of flexibility. It's back to your original question. What do you make of all of this? As a teacher who's facing the exam and feels the same pressure that Mr. Krieger feels to help students get 5s.
Okay, so I entered this discussion coming from a background in global studies. Most of my graduate work was as a globalist studying world history as a whole. And the way we, as world history historians, study things is we use case study approaches. We teach students, there's no way to teach all of world history, that's obvious. So instead we teach examples, and then we teach our students how to use those examples to predict the correct answer in other situations. That's how I see the flexibility. I don't need to teach the students every single progressive reformer. I can teach them one progressive reformer, teach them the pattern of the progressive age, and if a different situation appears on the exam, it's a stimulus-based question. So the students aren't approaching that multiple choice with nothing to work with. Instead, they're given a document, primary source document or a picture, something to work with. So they use the material they're given, that primary source document, plus the patterns that I have taught them, and then the flexibility works. The students can score. My students score quite well.
I think Senator Ligon wants to read one line.
I just wanted to read one line from page 20 of the framework, and it deals with the flexibility issue. It says, teachers may also investigate U.S. history with their students using themes or approaches of their own choosing, keeping in mind that, and this is all bold highlighted here, all questions on the AP U.S. history exam will measure student understanding of the specified thematic learning objectives. Now this tells me, in their own words, that what the test is measuring is what's in this framework.
Thank you, sir.
Would you like us to clarify that? Because that is not accurate.
Well, I just read the words.
But you drew a conclusion from those words that's not accurate, Senator.
Well, I took it, the plain meaning of the words is, that's how normally I was taught to construe documents. But.
No, you did make a connect. You said, I read this, and so I assume that this means X, and your assumption was not correct there. The learning objectives are 7 pages of the document. So what we are saying there is that to provide teachers with flexibility to draw content from their own state standards, we will limit our test questions to what is in those 7 pages so that teachers know, I'm not going to have to cover the National Organization for Women. I'm not going to have to cover Cesar Chavez because I teach in Georgia. I'm not going to have to cover the Greensboro 4 because I teach in California. By limiting our test questions to those 7 pages of learning objectives, that term learning objective that you focused is a reference to those 7 pages.
Right.
When a teacher is authorized to offer an AP course by the College Board, the only thing we require of the teachers is demonstration of their familiarity with those 7 pages, not the 80-page document or the 50-page document or the 142-page document. I hear different page lengths from those who are opposed.
What have you got against the Greensboro 4? You know, the lunch counter they sat at is prominently displayed in the Museum of American History. And that was an embodiment of Dr. King, who's left off the framework's nonviolent protest. They're pretty darn significant. I think students should learn about the Greensboro 4 and that it was egregious to leave them out.
Do you think the College Board should provide a list that every state has to follow? Do you think we should
specify
specify that? Excuse me. Let me finish my question. Do you believe the College Board should specify that no matter what state you live in, you all need to study the Greensboro 4?
Yeah, I do. And
okay.
in this
disagree.
document, yeah, I do. Because they're people of courage and conviction. In the modern civil rights movement, which was held here, kids, that's exactly what they should know about. Instead, we've got the Students for a Democratic Society highlighted and the Black Panthers.
Let's leave the Greensboro 4. I think we've got some other questions that I want to get to. Chairman Rye.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if I'm in an AP math course here or what. You're going to go through these numbers. I'm trying to follow what's going on here a little bit, but I'm kind of a simple guy on these things, and the people that oppose the current framework desire to go back to the old one, and yet when I look at things like page 10, where the old one is very open-ended, you teach anything out of it apparently, from what I can see, and you got these other on the right-hand side that seem to me to be the things that we'd want our kids to understand a little bit better. I guess the question is, what would you have us do? I mean, Senator Ligon has got a proposal to look at defunding this test, yet we've got a bunch of people who are already engaged in this. Doctor, you said that there should be a different vehicle but I don't know of any other vehicle. So we're in a situation where we've got kids that are going through, and they'll take that May course test. And I guess what we're going to find out is how well they do and how well the College Board does in terms of scoring those tests, and we'll find out a little bit more about the circumstances of how this has actually played out in that situation. So anyway, could you comment on that? What
Sure.
do you think we ought to do?
Well, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, but the resolution doesn't say that Georgia is to immediately withdraw from the AP program, but simply that if Georgia is unsatisfied within a year, exploration of alternatives will take place. And what I said in my opening talk is that I believe that there are efforts afoot right now to create alternatives to the College Board, and that they'll come to maturity within the next 1 to 2 years. So all I think that the resolution is calling for, which I would favor, is an expression of concern and dissatisfaction, and a promise that if satisfaction does not come around within the next year or so, Georgia will seriously look for alternatives. Now, if no alternatives that are satisfactory emerge, so be it. But I think this is the way to begin to open the market up.
Let me ask another question. Follow up on that. The ability to have the colleges, I don't know what the correct word is, certify the 3, 4, or 5 as an offset to their requirement for that particular course. Isn't that what directs what's in these curriculums? And how would any other organization fare any better if the University of Pennsylvania or University of Georgia or Florida, whatever it might be, the SEC conference, maybe that's all you all have, an SEC conference exam type of thing.
Well, the Texas State Board of Education passed a resolution somewhat similar to the one that Georgia is considering, condemning the framework and expressing its concern. I believe it was a couple of days ago that the state of Oklahoma took a very important vote in committee expressing concern. Texas by itself represents about 10% of the market. Now you put together Oklahoma, Texas, Georgia, throw in a couple other states because of the senator who said that there were quite a few states in the education association he's in. There is no way that even fancy private colleges are going to be able to keep out that number of people. These colleges are competing with each other. And if people hand them scores from a reputable company that says 3, 4, 5, and these colleges refuse to take those students, they're going to lose out. So that's how we open up markets in this country. Competition.
Dr. Packer?
I have no concerns about that. I do think we should underscore a key point just for your consideration. It was a really important moment a few minutes ago when Mr. Krieger said that his position should be that the College Board's framework should specify the Greensboro 4. Now, I know that we want to leave the Greensboro 4 behind, but what that would mean is that we would be saying to states like most states that do not have the Greensboro 4 in their standards, that we are requiring them to teach that. We are not going to take that position. We are not going to produce a framework that is the College Board listing all of the names that must be studied in every state, because that would be a complete violation of local control. We will persist with a framework that we need to strip of any ideological bias, but we will persist with a framework that does not contain names so that teachers like Mr. Hoagie and Mr. Krieger and others can select the content that they want to focus on in their states.
Well, I wouldn't prejudge what the alternative testing companies are going to do, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if you get a couple alternatives. One that decides to go the route of specifying particular facts, another one that's more conceptual but really different concepts than here. We need some choice. We need some alternative approaches because there are legitimate arguments about how to approach U.S. history, and right now we're stuck with one.
Just one more follow-up on that. I hear that the old framework was 5 pages. I've heard a lot of different things, 172 pages on the new framework. Could you comment as to what, from the College Board, what is the true number? I mean, how prescriptive, 5 pages to 172 seems like it's very prescriptive in terms of what, and limited on flexibility.
Yep, let's just look at it together so we can come to the same conclusion. You've got the old framework here in your packet. So you can look at the length of the old framework. Starts on page 7, runs through starts on page 6 and runs through page 11.
Okay. So it is 5 pages.
6 pages.
Okay.
5 to 6 pages is the old one. The new one to compare, the new document is a longer document because it contains sample exam questions, rubrics, things that are not efficient. Within this longer document, the framework itself runs from page, thanks Larry, from page 31 actually, in comparison. 31
See, I
to
can't agree with that. I don't see how you can set aside the themes. The themes in the preliminary material are what's controlling the one of the things, as well as the core framework that's controlling the concepts that are going to be taught. So it's really much longer. People have to teach according to the themes.
Good. Yep, I think that's fair. So let's include the pages that start with the themes start on page 20. So I think that's right because we're including the themes from the old document which start on page 6.
Mm-hmm.
So themes, the old document, themes and outlines. So we'll do themes and outline from the new document that starts on page 20 and runs through
To about 80, 81 or 82. So it's 60 pages versus 6.
Yep,
And
to
we're not
80.
including those first 7 pages you talked about that we just heard were absolutely crucial and had to be added. So we maybe should up it to 87.
Yeah.
87 versus
But I
5
got-
or 6.
No, I think the comparison is what we just agreed on. 6 pages versus 61.
But now, let me ask you this question. You had referenced a while ago like a 7-page framework that the teachers, what pages are those on?
They are within those pages that we just listed. They start on page 21 and run through page 27. Those are the 7 pages that the exam questions are drawn from and that are the only requirements the College Board has for labeling that course AP. So when a school applies to have their U.S. History course accepted into the AP program, these 7 pages is what they're required.
So that's the holy grail of AP US history.
That's the holy grail of AP US History. The exam
Okay.
questions all stem from there.
You got any more time? Thank you. Representative Belton.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say that, a quick statement. There's no appetite for this in Georgia. This to me is worse than Common Core. This debate. I think you've taught the worst part of Common Core and trying to inflict negatives on the dogma of New England dogma on the students of Georgia. I just think if you're saying the competition, you welcome that. Well, that's great, and you have a very slick presentation. But I think that the competition is coming. If this is the route you're going, that I think competition is coming. Thank you.
Can you actually, can we look at that though? These claims that are made, we really want to listen and hear these concerns. We want to see what this is because as I look at this, I see that Senate Resolution 80 claims that we minimize discussion of the Declaration of Independence.
Well, again, it's not.
I don't see that here.
Just as the representative here talked about Reagan, it's an overwhelming dogma throughout the entire document that it's negative, negative, negative. Of course, negative things happen in America, and in this nation, more than most nations, are willing to talk about the negative things. But it's about a lot of really good things happen in America, and those are being severely downplayed. I'm on the school board, and I got rid of a partisan book because it was too partisan. It was a Common Core book. And I think you're going to find that other states are going to do that with AP. If you continue, and what I'm hearing from you, sir, and I appreciate your honesty, is that, well, you think this is too negative, but we don't. Well, I think you're going to find that the people of Georgia are not going to agree with you. Thank you.
So we'd love your feedback on specific examples.
I can't go through the whole document with you, but I'm just telling you that we're hearing, the reason why we're here is because we believe through many, many different examples that this is too negative about American history.
So I think Senator Ligon's going to give some specific examples that can provide very specific direction to the College Board of things that you want.
I want to ask everyone to do that has a concern about AP US history. Don't talk in generalities. Put it on a piece of paper. This is specifically what I have a problem with. We can deal with specifics, but it's hard to hem up an objective. We've got 4 more speakers, I think. Representative Tanner.
Thank you. As a father of 3 daughters still in the public school system, education is a concern to me personally. But I want to make one comment, and then I want to ask a specific question. I think you may have actually answered when you were talking to Chairman Rice. Transparency is important, and first of all, I want to thank you for releasing the information. It's always appalling to me when I try to get information, whether it's from a local school system, the state, or Common Core, or any of these other organizations that will not give a parent information of a high school student about what their children are learning. So I don't know that we should have to thank people for that. That should just be automatic, that we should release this information to the public for public scrutiny. But specifically, are there, because I see this as I'm like several of the other comments, but I also recognize that as a father of daughters who will attend college, that we have to compete on a global world marketplace with education. And if my daughter wants to go to Harvard, I want her to receive an education in the public school system in Georgia that she can do that. I'll also know that our college system is bent to the left, and it was when I was in college, so that's not changed. But so I don't know how we provide college level credit in the high school that will be accepted with any college in the country unless we have some standard there. So that's a challenge. My question, though, is there any other state that has that offers AP classes that do not follow the College Board? That I know it sounds like some other states have passed resolutions, but everyone who offers AP credit that the colleges will accept all follow the same standard. Is that correct?
So there are different routes to receive college credit, excuse me. Different routes to receive college credit, but any school that is offering AP courses or is using AP exams for college credit, that is a trademark that our nonprofit organization owns. So yes, if schools in a state are using AP, they are using our course materials to shape their course, and they're using our exams. But there are many other options as well. The dual credit opportunities exist in most schools that offer AP courses. There's also a chance to get local college credit through your local college. And there's IB and Cambridge programs as well.
But every AP class that's offered in the United States to receive college credit offered in a high school that's called AP History, AP what is through the College Board. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Representative Kaiser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a question about flexibility. I guess I'm getting concerned about how much are we teaching to the test, and how much, I wish you would, not all four of you, but maybe one on each side, speak to how much flexibility in the classroom our teachers have given this outline. I'm the mother of two students who have one is taken and one's about to take the AP test. But I think when you're talking about that, I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that we don't all agree here, and this is a great academic conversation. I just want us to be careful about beginning to legislate it. Sounds like there are two sides that are coming together as a result of this, so I hope that happens. But I think for me, as the mother of two boys, very different, who see things very differently, I want them, most importantly, when they take a test of any kind, that they understand that their ability to sort of interpret primary documents, to understand that there are different interpretations. So I think that whatever you decide to do, whether you help them fix the problems in this test, that I hope we don't lose sight of that, you know, there are biases. We all come from very different backgrounds, and so for my children's sake, I would want, I mean, isn't that part of the new test, is we're not teaching to trivia, we're not teaching them that, we're really teaching them to understand these documents. And
yeah, earlier we had discussed this idea of a student being able to support, refute, or modify, and the argument was made that no teacher would dare do that. I do it. I've only been doing this 2 years. I'm not a super veteran, and I feel confident teaching my students. I absolutely teach my students, encourage them to draw their own conclusions. I'm a department chair, and I insist on that in my department. And I feel like it happens. I feel like the students are comfortable drawing their own conclusions. They live in a world where they get media from every direction. Even if I tried to indoctrinate them, I don't think I could with the amount of media that they receive from a variety of different perspectives. So I feel very strongly that I'm teaching my students to support, refute, or modify any argument that's presented to them. And I feel that I would assume other teachers feel comfortable with that as well. I would hope.
Well, I applaud your ideals and your goals. I really do. I think that's terrific. However, the pragmatic reality of the matter is it's only taught 2 years. This is the first year with the new test, so we've got to see what the new test looks like and see what your results are. see how things go. But contrary to what you seem to believe, based upon the evidence we have at this moment with the practice sample test, there's not as much opportunity for flexibility as you seem to believe, and the shortest route to a very high score is, in fact, through the framework itself and its biases. Keep something else in mind. Kids are under a lot of pressure when they take this test. So we look at those 4 short answer questions, which are new and which have drawn a lot of attention. These are the ones they use as their examples of flexibility. They only count 20% of the test. There are 4 questions. You only have a little over about 11 minutes per question. So you're asking teenage kids, 16, 17 years old, to tackle these questions and then to say, ah, yes, I remember back in October when in class, I'll just pull that in. It's not how it's going to play out. They're going to go right to the framework. They're going to go right to its biases, right to its content, which there's quite a bit, and they're going to put those answers down. So it is my view that, as I've said before, there's not as much flexibility as they're saying, and that the shortest route to a high score is through the biases, regrettable, but that's it, of the framework.
It's just not what we heard from teachers and students. We don't make these decisions willy-nilly or on the fly at the College Board. We need to continue to earn the public's trust. So before making these changes to the exam, we piloted the new exam with students, and we heard overwhelmingly positive feedback from students who
Where'd
said—
you pilot it?
In schools throughout the country, as we always do.
Marist High School right down the street.
Yeah.
Excuse me, let me finish my statement, please.
I want
She's a
to
big
call on
proponent of
Senator
the
Crane.
College Board.
She actually was not a supporter of the change. Initially, Louisa Moffat.
Yeah.
So,
sure, I know who she is.
To respond, to complete my response to your statement,
Yeah.
students loved it because what they said is this exam gives us the opportunity to read the primary source documents for ourselves and then respond with our understanding of history. It gives us the space to craft historical arguments, to practice writing them, rather than plowing through nitty-gritty multiple choice questions. So teachers love the changes, students love the changes to this exam. It's a demonstrably more balanced and fair exam because it focuses on primary source documents rather than nitty-gritty multiple choice questions.
Senator Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the panel for your straightforward approach to the idea, and I would like to thank AP for being visible with this exam. A quick question for you, if I may. Is this your best foot forward? I presume this is a good example of what the exams are going to look like for AP, and so they're reflective. Is this available online?
It is.
Excellent. Did you let the people know? Because I would encourage folks to look at this. My question is, you refer to page 10 over here in the 7 ideals that you say are emphasized in your new AP history. And I just looked at this while I was sitting down. I do not see any reference to any of these ideals in a clear way that I understand these ideals in this document at all. I see no reference to the Constitution of the United States. I see no reference to the Federalist Papers or the Anti-Federalist Papers or the documents that those documents came from. If our students don't have an understanding of those frameworks, they can't have an understanding to the defeat of slavery. They can't have an understanding of the rise of the civil rights movement. Those things came out of a representative republic, not a democracy. And you maintain that we are the world's first modern mass democracy. Sir, we are not. We are a representative republic. I refer you to our Constitution. Let it show up in here, and you might get my support. That wasn't a question. I'm sorry.
I didn't see one. You want to respond?
Sure. So there are limited. There's a limited number of time for testing students on an AP exam. So not every AP exam has all the same documents on it. So the practice exam has the Declaration of Independence on it, the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, quotes from FDR, from Reagan, from Truman. From Reagan, from Clinton, Jacob Reese, and so on.
No, it does have those, but you have to look at the questions. And folks, go look at this. Find this online. And look at the questions, and don't only look at what the answer is. Look at the other 3 not answers. They are pushing forward an agenda, an ideology, a framework of thinking that is very dangerous to this republic.
Could you show us one of those as an example?
I think, Mr. Chairman. certainly, I think page by page, I could dissect this entire, but go ahead, if you will.
Would welcome that. This is the sort of feedback we want. We want.
I would like, in the interest of time, I would like for you to get us answers to this and give us copies of it. I'd love to have a copy of it. Any feedback that's forwarded to College Board, I'd love to have a copy of it from anybody in this room to review.
This is the capitalism, free enterprise. I'll be happy to give you a great example, and I do this for your edification. The framework never mentions the terms free enterprise, entrepreneurs. Thomas Edison, who's in your Georgia standards, is not present. But we do have big business. Now, as described in the framework, we've got a really good slide that quotes the framework. Big business is not such a good player. Big business corrupts politicians. It despoils the environment. It battles conservationists and laborers. All in the framework. We've got a slide we're happy to show you. Now, the transfer to the test. If you go to page 16 of the test, we see a group of immigrants by Jacob Rice. They're no doubt from the Lower East Side of New York. And there they are. And then we're asked in question 24, conditions like those shown in the image contributed most directly to which of the following? And so we look at question 24, and the answer to that is, Mr. Trevor, an increase in progressive reform activity. The bias here is for the progressives. They're the heroes in this little story that's being played out before you in these allegedly bias-free questions. Now, 25, the conditions shown in the image came about most directly as a result of, well, you could argue they were immigrants. They didn't speak the language. They didn't have the skills. They came to America. They'll raise themselves up. I taught a lot of their grandchildren in Homedale, New Jersey, actually, because they were coming from Italy. And they'll make it, but it's going to take a little bit of time. And so the answer to that question is the conditions shown came about most directly by A, the low wages earned by workers in the late 19th century. Well, they earned low wages because they had low skills. And then we come to the key one. Advocates for individuals, such as those shown in the image, would have most likely agreed with which of the following perspectives? And the answer is D. Government should act to eliminate the worst abuses of industrial society. Government is needed to correct this problem. And look at the wrong answer, choice B. Capitalism would improve social conditions. Capitalism's bad. It's mentioned once or twice in this document. Capitalism is not good. Free enterprise is never mentioned at all. Entrepreneurs, not mentioned, not a term. And so what we have in these stimulus-based questions, which come with, there's a stimulus, this picture, and then we have 3, 4, 5, as many as 6 questions, but here are 3. It enabled the test writers to have a subliminal message. Somebody was right when they said before, let's look at the wrong answers here too that are being rejected by students. Capitalism is the wrong answer. Now the same little play is being played out in the next set of questions on John Muir's. I won't eat up too much time. It's the same play in which Muir is writing about an environmental issue. Personally, I'm on Muir's side in this, but that's beside the point. And the problem, of course, is the answer is government should preserve wilderness areas in a national state. And Muir's position regarding the wilderness was most strongly opposed by which of the following? The answer, companies involved in natural resource extraction. They're the bad guys here. So these are amazingly biased questions rooted in a presentation of the American economy, which astoundingly enough leaves out free enterprise and entrepreneurs totally and really gives a biased presentation of big business interests. Thank you. I really appreciate being able to.
So when we've spoken with historians about these questions, what they would say is it's not a biased question to ask students what a loyalist believed during the Revolutionary War. The students should be familiar with a passage from a loyalist writer and what that loyalist agenda was. It's not biasing students in favor of the Confederates to ask students to analyze the military strategy of General Lee. That's not biased to ask students to analyze the motives or objectives of key historical figures. So what you see throughout the AP exam are a multitude of perspectives. Perspectives of reformers, perspectives of non-reformers, perspectives of politicians, perspectives of women, perspectives of minorities, and students are asked to read passages from them and to represent what their arguments were. We're asking students to pay attention to what the arguments are of past Americans. Jacob Riis is well within the mainstream of American history. Mr. Krieger's own book sees Jacob Riis as essential content. It is not biased to ask the students whether or not what Jacob Riis's agenda was. Jacob Riis's agenda was not to promote capitalism. Jacob Riis's agenda was to try to get government to eliminate these situations of poverty that he was photographing. Other AP exams would have passages by Andrew Carnegie. And then the right response to Carnegie's position would be response B.
But that's really not how the framework works. I agree with Trevor Packer that any given question by itself is not necessarily proof of bias. You have to know what the progressives thought, what the opponents of the progressives thought. But if you look at the framework, there is almost nothing positive about what free enterprise, what capitalism has done to balance all of the problems. So when you see these problematic questions, they mount up on one side and an underlying message comes through. No one is final proof of bias, but if you look at the overall treatment of the positives of the immigration experience, the positives of the free enterprise system, the framework is extraordinarily weak or almost silent on a large part of that, but it gives a luxuriant amount of time to the negatives. So one-sidedness to me is the core of the problem.
I just want to point out that you do have this document that I created in your folder. I would invite you to look for yourself. I think that's probably the most powerful thing I can ask you to do. I specifically went through the curriculum framework and pulled out any references that I felt were about American free enterprise system, and I laid them next to the Georgia Performance Standards that address the same topics. The one thing that I would like to point out is that a teacher, according to this framework, can teach Adam Smith as an Enlightenment philosopher. They could teach Adam Smith as an enlightened philosopher and ideas that inspired American political thinkers. So it's perfectly acceptable within this framework to teach laissez-faire capitalism and to teach Adam Smith as an Enlightenment philosopher driving American political policy. That sounds pretty pro-capitalist to me.
Okay, I have promised Senator Ligon that he can put some slides up that do a face-to-face comparison from the framework, and I want to call on Senator Ligon now to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just quickly, going to the theme of America in the world, if you could put up those slides of the different learning objectives. And what I would say about this is that as you read these, it seems to draw upon that perspective of that America is seen as a part of the Atlantic world. And Dr. Kurtz, could you expound on this for us a little bit and explain how that works through these?
Absolutely. The framework highlights something called the Atlantic world. And the article I mentioned earlier in my testimony by Gordon Wood, one of the things Gordon Wood complains about is that the William and Mary Quarterly, the main journal of early American history, has so many articles that aren't even about America anymore. And what you see in the treatment in the framework and in the first textbook, the Henrietta textbook I mentioned that follows the framework, is that the moral center of early American history becomes the slave trade, because they're looking at international exchanges of commodities and the effect that that has on the labor market, for example. So whereas before the real center of early American history was the settlement of the New England colonies and the religious motivations of the Pilgrims and the Puritans, now we have a focus on the slave trade, on the evils of international capitalism, and on the focus of the textbook that is based on the new framework really becomes slavery in Virginia. And the explanations and the issues focus on material causes rather than the ideas now, is it completely absent? Is any discussion of New England absent? No. But there is a shift in focus when you start talking about the Atlantic world, instead of having the actual subject of history be the United States. And in the article, one of the articles I gave you, How the College Board Politicized U.S. History, this fellow Thomas Bender, who had such an influence on the College Board, he said we shouldn't think about Columbus as having discovered America. We should think about Columbus as having discovered the ocean world that unites all of the different continents in a global community. So this, when we look at the Atlantic world and the focus on the slave trade, everything has been decentered. Again, the traditional stuff is not totally absent, but it is greatly downplayed.
Okay, would you like to respond?
I'd just like to point out that in the framework, the exchange across the Atlantic, while slavery is included, also includes agricultural goods, fur, agriculture, metals, tobacco specifically, staple crops.
Sure, but the emphasis in the textbook is that these are all part of an international exchange
We're
system.
not talking about the textbook, though. I'm sorry. We're talking about the framework.
All right, it's in the framework
And to be very clear about that, to be very clear, the AP program does not have a textbook. We do not, there isn't an AP textbook. We encourage schools to select a textbook that represents college level material, and it is the school's choice which textbook to use. So I want to be very clear.
Well,
no
two of the members of the committee that authored the framework have endorsed the textbook I'm speaking about as an excellent exemplar of what the new AP US History framework is trying to do. I can well imagine that attention wants to be deflected from the textbook, because this is what's actually going to be studied by the students of Georgia. And I'm telling you, it's terribly problematic compared to the traditional teaching of U.S. history. And the emphasis in the framework and the textbook is on how all of these economic, labor exchanges are all part of an international system that turns around slavery. That becomes the theme that ties everything together.
I would also just say that African Americans are a huge percentage of our population. Why would we ever minimize the slave trade?
It absolutely shouldn't be minimized. It should be mentioned and it should be highlighted. But now it's being highlighted at the expense. When you start talking about the Atlantic world, you're really going beyond a focus on traditional American history. You're getting out of balance in just the way that Gordon Wood spoke about in that article. Should it be mentioned? Absolutely. It's of great importance. Should it be the focus? No. And I do think the focus should be, as it traditionally has been, the settlement of New England on religious motives. That becomes a sidebar in the framework.
So this is important, and I think this is one of those things that's helpful about this conversation. One of the action items clearly is one that I think is right here, and I appreciate the clarity with which Professor Kurtz framed that. One of the things that needs to be examined closely by the committee over these next few months is, within that colonial period, is the balance right between issues of trade, between issues of identity, between issues of settlement and religion. What I do need to add, though, is that in the same way that you've asked us to be very cognizant of the influence we have on what's taught in schools, because so many schools choose AP, and because you see that there may not be other options that schools are choosing, you've asked us to be very cognizant of that, and we're really trying to do that. More than the College Board ever has, we're trying to do that. On the other hand, though, I would ask you to be equally respectful of the impact that your words have on the way the public perceives our private, nonprofit organizations program. And when you have a Senate resolution that says that we minimize the role of religion, when factually and demonstrably we have not. The old framework mentioned religion 3 times. The new one emphasizes the religious influences in American history 31 times. How many times do Georgia's own standards mention religion? 3 times.
Well, those numbers are unfair and meaningless because there's only 5 pages in the original thing. Naturally, there'll be more mentions in a massively longer document. That's a very misleading statistic.
I'd like to ask that there not be further interruptions. We have not interrupted Mr. Krieger or Professor Kurtz once.
Sure.
But repeatedly, when we are responding to questions or issues that they raise, we are not able to finish our comments, and that's inappropriate.
Since you raised the issue of religion, did you have a comment on that, of how religion is addressed within the framework? Or do you have any concerns about that?
I do, actually. It was one of the very first things that I noticed when I looked at the framework for the very first time, and that was the de-emphasis of New England. If you look at the New England coverage, you'll see it's just one short sentence. I remember thinking, well, where is Winthrop City on a Hill? Where's Roger Williams in the new framework? He's the first great meaningful dissenter in American history. Now, previous exams asked a number of questions about religious toleration and the factors responsible for religious toleration in America. And I just don't see that. We don't see a good coverage of this absolutely essential part of the American experience. So I have to agree with Dr. Kurtz. Just numbers are meaningless because one document is 5 pages long, the other is, well, at least 60. But the reality of the matter is when you go to New England and you look at that single sentence there, you don't see some very important traditional parts of the American narrative that pertain to religion. Also, where's William Penn and the Quakers? They're not present either.
Once again, Mr. Krieger is asking the College Board to impose on all states one list of names. We're not going to do that. Are those names in your state standards? If not, it would be inappropriate for the College Board to say to all your schools, you must all study Roger Williams. That would be inappropriate. We're not going to do that.
I would like to move on to another example on the slide on free enterprise.
We kind of covered that.
Page 6.
In the framework.
Number 15.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure which one you want.
Okay. And when I looked through the framework, I did not see the concept of free enterprise, entrepreneurs within the framework. Now, go to the next slide, and I show that. I mean, there's nothing there, and I show that because the next slide shows what we do see about business and enterprise. It's that let's see, monopolies sought to maximize the exploitation of natural resources in a growing labor force. There's this idea that government agencies and conservationist organizations are contending with corporate interests. Go to the next slide, please. It's that business interests battled conservationists as the latter sought to protect unspoiled wilderness, and corporate corruption in government, especially as it related to big business, energized the public. It seems as if whenever we see anything about business, it's somehow tied to something that's somewhat negative. I'm not saying that we're pounding on them, but there's this association, a very subtle association, that somehow there's something bad or wrong with business, and there is absolutely no concerted focus on the virtues of free enterprise. And it's not clearly articulated at all within the framework. So it would just jump out at you and say, yes, this is something that we find really important as a part of the American experience. Whereas through this framework, I mean, it looks like business is something that's just always horrible. Would y'all like to comment on that?
I'd want to thank you for that feedback. I think that's excellent and precise feedback and exactly what is so helpful about a public review period like this. So thank you. We'll take that feedback and look closely at that. I think that's incredibly helpful. I am curious to hear what Mr. Hoagie has to say about that, given his use of the framework to teach free enterprise and capitalism.
Well,
but I think the feedback is excellent.
Yeah,
and I appreciate
let me
that.
interrupt you because
sure.
He may teach one thing, but I'm looking at what you have written within your framework. And to me, the framework is, it is the gospel of what you're going to be doing. I mean, it is critical. I mean, you're going to base your test off of it. Textbook companies are going to look at it, and they're going to write their textbooks from it. And so when you put something out into words and you say, this is the framework, it is highly important. And while I appreciate us getting off into the test, this framework, it's a framework, and you're going to build everything off of the framework. And so when we see that you're omitting these things, in my mind, you have a defective framework in a sense. So,
yeah, again, thanks for the feedback. I think that's helpful and precise. The reason I signaled to the teacher, though, was that sometimes that I wasn't quite, I wanted to be sure, teachers, because they have training in history and are used to using these documents to shape their course, may see examples of free enterprise and capitalism that you or I would not have seen so clearly. So while I agree again with the feedback, and we will take that to the committee for further work, I think that's helpful and precise. I did want to get a sense from the teacher as to what, and from the other panelists, whether they see positive depictions of capitalism and free enterprise in the framework, or if they have the same sense that you do, that treatments of business are generally a little cynical. It sounds like that's what you were saying. What do you all see?
I don't see the positives there, and I want to say it isn't just an absence of it. This period is a period when the miracle of the Industrial Revolution and economic growth and prosperity increased for all Americans in a dramatic way. That never comes across in the framework. But also when you shift to the environmental issue, think of the different way in which these same points could have been posed. It could have said there were complex tensions between the need to balance prosperity and wealth that was newly growing up in America with environmental threats. You could pose it as a choice, which I think is what it ultimately is, between competing goods and people differing on how they balance it. Whereas the way these concepts, this is what I mean when I said that the framework tells you how to think about American history. The way these concepts are written almost forces you to think negatively about business and to be blind to the fact that these kind of environmental issues involved a balance of competing goods.
But the framework does say directly the emergence, and again, I'm not trying to disagree with the point. I think the feedback is helpful and appropriate. This is the sort of thing we need and are seeking. But I don't agree with the statement that the framework is always negative about industry and business. It says directly the emergence of an industrial culture in the United States led to greater opportunities.
Right, and I waited under that heading. I said, okay, now I'm going to get to the subheads where they really go into all those opportunities. And I didn't find any. Yeah. These are token mentions at the head of a giant section, but all of the details are just like the details that Senator Ligon put up on the screen.
Yep, I think that's helpful feedback. Thank you.
So you say we're right? Are you saying we're right?
So it is not my role to say right or wrong here, because this work should be done by committees of teachers and professors who are trained in history. So that's why I think all of these panelists have helpful perspectives.
Could you find some different professors that have a more balanced point of view?
We would welcome any nominees that you have.
And I say that seriously.
We would welcome nominees that you have.
About the committee that's doing the review work, is this committee the precise same group of people who, in fact, have claimed authorship of the framework?
So there are partly yes and partly no. There's regular rotation of committee members. So I want to be very careful in my response because I don't know how many rotations there have been since you've seen the list, Mr. Krieger.
The list is right here. Back in the day of the Texas hearings, the Texas Board of Education was extremely concerned with this feedback process. And their biggest concern was that the feedback process, this valuable information, is actually going back to the precise same group of people who created this document. And I know for a fact the Texas chairwoman at the time and Texas representatives implored the College Board to create a new committee, a much more inclusive committee that didn't have a vested interest in this document.
So I can speak. So I understand the question more fully now, Mr. Krieger. You're asking who exactly, what are the differences between the people that will be meeting to review and make the edits based on public feedback and the initial committee? So the committee, plus or minus rotations, will be there. In addition, the committee is joined by the leaders of the American Historical Association, OAH, NCHE, Checker Finn, and his representatives. I'm surprised you roll your eyes at
I would like to move on to the next slide. There's just a few more. Yeah. And now this is an interesting concept of manifest destiny, which is different from what I learned when I was in school, and I majored in history in college, and so I would like for Mr. Kruger to tell us what has traditionally been explained as manifest testimony, and highlight how this differs and what is the significance of this within the new framework.
Thank you very much. You know, I've been sharply castigated for thinking that the Greensboro Four and Roger Williams should be on the test. We'd never do that. But here, what we do is we take a very key concept in American history, the idea of manifest destiny, and we give quite the definition. This really caught my eye the first time I saw the test. It was built on a belief in white racial superiority and a sense of American cultural superiority. Oh my gosh. This is not what I was taught in high school, college. It's not what I taught my kids for over 35 years. My students and I learned and I taught my students that manifest destiny was the spread of American principles, new technology, benefits across the country. There's a famous image, a famous painting, which the College Board likes to put on tests. That's fine with me. And it shows liberty going across the country, bringing the telegraph, bringing the telephone, bringing new improvements in agriculture, creating new states that are republics. That's what manifest destiny is all about. And we're given a spin here which ties very closely into what Stanley said. This goes into the true origins. This is here for a reason. It's here because they were heavily influenced by Dr. Fred Anderson from the University of Colorado's book, in which he feels that what the real theme is America, the imperialist power. And that's what we have here. We have the same thing, by the way, on the Monroe Doctrine. The imperialist America spreading its tentacles across the country. Is this really what we want our students to learn about America? But meantime, great heroes like the Greensboro Four. As I said before, the lunch counters in the Smithsonian Museum of American History, for goodness sakes. No, we would never do that. But we're only too happy to give you a new super revisionist definition of manifest destiny.
So this is one that we agree should be revised. The committee has already flagged this one to edit. We agree with those concerns. That said, what is happening here, and I want to draw attention to this, and I'm looking to the chair for guidance as to how we should proceed in a balanced and fair way with this hearing. What I'm concerned about is that excerpts from the framework are being pulled out, and the corresponding positive statements are not being shown. This is a tactic we've seen over and over again from those who oppose the framework. They will mention a negative claim in the framework, but not show all the corresponding positive ones. So I'm curious, will we have an opportunity, in the same way that Senator Ligon is taking us through a set of isolated statements in 60 pages, statements that are concerning and that we agree should be changed, will we have the opportunity to share concerns about the wording of SR 80 and the inaccuracies that it conveys about our work?
If you want to address SR 80, we've addressed the Greensboro 4 about half a dozen times today, so I'm guessing nothing's off the table.
I'd like to say something.
But do you want to have a positive sort of counter statement to this one?
If I could, I would just like to point out that Roman numeral 2 at 3.3 says that as
what
the
pages?
I'm sorry, I have it on a different document. I apologize. But it's 3.3, I believe, is where I am. The policies of the United States that encourage Western migration and the orderly incorporation of new territories into the nation, both extended Republican institutions and intensified conflict. So your concern about the sort of idea of spreading American ideals is there. I mean, maybe
but
it's not as much.
Here's the concern. Here's the concern. Why would you even allow such an obviously biased and inaccurate statement to be published in a framework? I mean, you are the College Board, and this is not the only concern. I mean, there are multiple concerns, and yes, it is natural for us to highlight the concerns. I mean, we're not saying that everything in here is bad. I mean, there are some good things, but there are a lot of things that are inaccurate and it seems that the lens, these inaccuracies start painting a perspective of how you're now presenting history in a new and a revisionist way. So why would you even allow such a document to come out from the College Board?
Yep. So this statement in particular, and I would dispute what you just claimed, that the framework is full of inaccuracies. I do not see inaccuracies in the framework. What I see are concerns about wording that represent a historical perspective that may tilt to the left or tilt to the right. In fact, the first set of concerns about the document did not come from the right. They came from the left, about this being too conservative and traditional a teaching of American history. So we've heard it from both sides, just to be clear. In this case, I see this as the most egregious example of something that needs to be changed in the framework. That said, the original perspective from college faculty, and this points to the concerns we flagged multiple times in the conversation today, that it is difficult to create a course that qualifies a student for college credit if you're trying to, without engaging college faculty in the defining and the writing of the documents. So what some will say, and again, we're going to push against this and we will change this because it looks incredibly imbalanced to me, this statement in particular. This is, in my mind, the low point of the AP curriculum framework. So I'm glad you would flag it. To finish my sentence in terms of why would we allow this to happen was your question. Why would the College Board allow this? The perspective from many higher education institutions is to cite the primary source documents that first mentioned Manifest Destiny. And again, I'm a little bit out of my depth here as a non-historian. But my understanding is that college faculty and other historians point to documents that talk about the desire to spread the great light of Anglo-Saxon superiority among the benighted populace. And they point to terms like that, Anglo-Saxon superiority, that are in the original documents, spreading Anglo-Saxon superiority among the benighted nations, and they say that's historical evidence that people were trying to, that there was a belief that there was white racial superiority. I'm not trying to defend that. As I've already said, we agree that that should be changed, but to answer the question directly, why is that in there? Because there are a significant number of historians who see that as an accurate description of the primary source document.
Well, yes, there are. There are a number of historians who not only see that issue of racial superiority, which was there, but they try to link that to this idea of cultural superiority, as if the belief in spreading democracy was just another form of bias. And this is not isolated in the framework. Even when they talk about Tom Paine and the fundamental ideas of human rights, they use this word superiority. Superiority is a scare word, whereas you could say that the principles of equality and liberty are universally applicable. That is read through the lens of the framework as superiority. Now, is this the low point? I thought Ronald Reagan was the low point. There are a lot of low points here. This is not isolated. We've got example after example after example. This is pervasive, and I don't believe it can be fixed. And the fact that you say that faculty members said, hey, this whole thing is way too conservative, I think that's very illustrative of the point I made earlier, which is we're never going to come in this country to a complete agreement on how to treat American history. So we've got to have competition and a market to open up choice, because different states are going to have different preferences in how we balance all of these things. The idea of creating a camel as a horse designed by a committee, the idea of creating a perfect document that pleases everyone is pretty much going to be impossible. Once the College Board went beyond a list of facts to these rich concepts, it was bound to stir up a hornet's nest. And as long as they persist in that, we've got to have competition and choice.
Okay. You go to the next slide, please. Let's see. Yeah. Then the Monroe Doctrine. The word dominance. Mr. Krug, could you comment on the statement of the Monroe Doctrine?
Yeah, this is the flip side of the Manifest Destiny coin. Now, once again, we come to a hallowed part of American history, the Monroe Doctrine. The United States in 1823 is not too powerful. In fact, we're still a pretty weak, embryonic country. But there have just been revolutions in the Western Hemisphere throwing off the Spanish and creating democratic institutions. And so President Monroe, in the first major foreign policy statement since Washington's farewell address, said, we're going to try our best to protect democratic institutions in the Western Hemisphere. And this idea, this goes right to the heart of American exceptionalism, that America is going to be defender of liberty and freedom at home and around the world. And every single president who has sent American boys into harm's way has defended that decision based on the fact that we're defending and protecting democratic institutions and freedom. And that's what the Monroe Doctrine is saying. But the spin here is, oh no, see, this is the imperialist America. We're spreading imperialism across the continent, calling it manifest destiny, and we sought dominance over the North American continent through a variety of means, including military actions. In 1823, I'm unaware right now of any military actions, judicial decisions, and diplomatic efforts. And of course, the diplomatic effort, it says right below it, is the Monroe Doctrine. So I have to say, this is right up there on the egregious list. It really is. And it's there for a reason, because you see, it is a manifestation of the true trains of thought that Dr. Kurtz has explained that brought this into being.
Good. So it will be incredibly helpful for us to have these slides so that we can
Sure.
flag each of these for committee review. This is very helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do you have anything to add? Okay, great.
Okay, go to the next slide.
Okay.
And I believe we may be talking about how, kind of going back in history a little bit, maybe how it, yeah, the rigid racial hierarchy and how the British were portrayed, and if you could comment on that.
Yes, I'd love to address this one. So, unlike the Spanish, French, and Dutch colonies, which accepted intermarriage and cross-racial sexual union with native peoples, and in Spain's case with enslaved Africans, English colonies attracted both males and females who rarely intermarried with either native peoples or Africans, leading to the development of a rigid racial hierarchy. Now, this is interesting to me, among other reasons, because it's a negative comparison between the English colonists and all of the other colonists. And this is something that actually comes up again and again. I think there are 3 times in which the framework makes essentially the same negative comparison.
Actually, if you go to the next framework, the next slide, there's another example.
And then there are a couple other times when, without making the direct comparison, they allude to the same things. In other words, there are 5 different passages in the framework that touch on this point. Now, I don't see anything in the framework that makes a positive comparison between the English colonists and the other colonists. And traditionally, people would come at this and say, well, you had authoritarian regimes in the lands that were colonized by the Spanish, whereas the Americans drew on English common law and developed democratic and representative traditions. So this negative comparison is one-sided. And again, this point is hammered again and again and again. It isn't just one isolated point. It comes up 5 times.
Could we respond to this one?
Sure.
I disagree fairly strongly with this. As you've seen in the slides that we've distributed, there are many, many laudatory statements about the New England colonies and about the...
In comparison to other European powers, their colonists?
I am not convinced, although this will be the committee's decision and in interactions with other historians around the country, that it is inappropriate to flag the differences between New England settlers and others who interacted with minority populations.
I'm not criticizing the inclusion of this. I'm saying that when you make a negative comparison between the English and all the other colonists, or in most of the other cases between the English and the Spanish, and you do it so many times, why is there not a favorable comparison between the English and the other colonists?
There are.
You may point to some positive statements about the English, but I don't see any positive comparisons between the English and the other colonists.
Good. So there are positive statements. We can pull them out for you. So again, we'll flag all of these. This one, though, it will be important for us to give respect to the we do have concerns. The narrative of the experiences of African Americans and others has been underprivileged in past frameworks and in the past study of American history. And so we won't back away from ensuring that students are looking at the history of interactions among ethnic and racial groups within the United States. But we will we'll flag this, and I think your point that you're asking us to be sure of is that if there are comparisons, the comparisons not only be negative. Again, I don't believe they are only negative, but we'll check that.
Do we have any more questions from elected officials? Senator Sanders.
Just a statement. I'm still puzzled by the presentation. It seems as if there's, are you guys the only printers of the AP? Okay, so there's a monopoly here. All right, now we're getting somewhere. And are you guys saying that we need to do a little purging of history? Is that what you're saying?
No, it's just this last example. I was not asking for this to be cut out. I was saying that this is included, but the reverse sort of comparison is not included as well. That's what I mean when I say one-sided.
Okay. But there's a monopoly here.
There's a monopoly.
We would not agree with that.
Well,
We're a private, nonprofit organization that has been in
Are
place
you
for
all
over
the
100
only
years.
printers of the AP test?
We are the owners of the AP program.
Okay.
The sponsors of that program. In the
Is
state.
there in the state of Georgia? Is there another organization in the nation?
For advanced placement, that's our program. We own advanced placement. Other organizations own different programs to help students get college credit.
I see it.
Cambridge, and so on.
So there appears to be a feeling that you're not your writings or your information is biased and left leaning. Is that what
That's
we're
correct.
hearing?
There are concerns that the new AP framework, which our goal has been to make transparent and put in front of the public for the first time, is left leaning. Others would say it's right leaning or too conservative.
But
Our
as
position is to be
a
neither.
teacher, and my first question I asked was, how do you propose to monitor academic biases in a classroom? The superintendent that told me not to teach anything about Africa, guess what I did? That's the first thing I taught. Because when you close that door, that classroom is yours, unless there's somebody there to monitor you every day to see what you're doing, period by period. So, I agree there should be some balance in everything we do. But there is no way you can erase a person's influence, a teacher's influence on his or her class.
We agree with that. It's not the College Board's role
That's
to
true.
control teachers.
And you're
ensure that
absolutely
every
right.
teacher teaches the same course. Every college professor doesn't teach the same course.
Mhm.
So it is not our intent to have every teacher teach the exact same topics. Teachers should select topics from their local standards.
I agree with you.
That said, by producing a framework, our goal is to give teachers a shield for teaching a more balanced view of American history than has frequently happened in the past. That by providing them with a framework that when we get it to the point where we all agree that this is an optimal framework, that will be a shield for teachers to focus on stuff that others may be pushing them not to focus on.
Thank you.
If I might comment on the monopoly discussion one more time. At my high school, Centennial High School, students have the option, of course, of dual enrollment, as I've already said, but we have a magnet school within Fulton County that offers the IB program. So students who are zoned to Centennial High School have the choice to participate in the IB program, which is a separate option for college credit based on successful passage of an exam. The meeting that I'm missing right now to be in this committee is a focus group on adding IB to Centennial High School.
Does IB do U.S. history?
Yeah, they do U.S.
History of the Americas.
History of the Americas.
I believe that's what it's called. I'm not
Sounds like the Atlantic world.
I don't have confidence that you would like it.
Right.
The only
Students receive U.S. history credit for Emory, Georgia Tech, Georgia, if they did well on the IB test.
Esteemed Representative Chandler, high school, there was a
I believe they would. Most schools would accept that. Just a couple of comments. One, this AP U.S. history is an election. And that is a concern to me in all of this. Nobody makes this statement. But with that comment made, may I ask both of you folks a question? First of all, are you going to, and I know this is a daunting task, but with this being the first year of the new test, are you going to be, I guess, collectively gathering information from those teachers?
And we'd be happy to share that with you. We're surveying all teachers in all states to ask them for their perspectives. How did the framework shift what they taught? Did they teach different content than before? What content did they teach differently? Did the new exam give them more flexibility or less? We want to be able to quantify this and share this with you so that you have accurate information about how the teachers in your state are responding. We want to know that for ourselves.
That would be good.
Great.
I got 6 board election here.
And also to see how the scores.
Okay, Tom, thanks for coming.
And then, sir, are you thinking in terms of like ACT having a similar program to the AP?
Something like that. I think you're going to see the development within another year or two of a competing company that would offer something. I think advanced placement is a trademark term, but something equivalent to advanced placement. I also want to emphasize, as I said in my testimony, but it hasn't come up yet, this is going to reach every AP subject, as I understand it. The College Board is in the process of issuing long frameworks analogous to the new history framework in U.S. government and politics, ultimately European history, a whole series of other topics covering the whole curriculum. From my perspective, that creates a risk that we're going to look at a national school board, that we're going to look at a company that just has too much control over every single part of what the top quarter or third. And remember, the number of students taking AP tests is expanding tremendously. So increasingly, we are talking about what might ultimately become the top 30, 40, even 50% of students taking courses which are deeply shaped by one nonprofit company on issues that we've just heard conservatives and liberals can't even agree on which side the bias is on. That just seems to me like a tremendously dangerous situation.
Unfortunately, related to what you're saying,
Go ahead, no, John. Joyce, go ahead.
our schools today in Georgia so many times are being evaluated on how many kids take AP courses and how many kids take the AP exam, not the scores of the kids. And I'd like to see more emphasis on that. I think that would be really important. But going back to what he is saying, because I've heard the same thing, that it's going to be government and so forth. Are you all holding off on that till some solution has come about with this U.S. history?
No, what we've heard consistently from teachers, who we see as our primary constituent, teachers, parents, students, what we've heard from the teachers is that the new frameworks actually reduce the College Board's pressure on them to cover all things. As this teacher said very clearly, and it's what we've heard consistently from teachers across the country, and our data show it, the new framework, because it writes things at the conceptual level and constrains what the test questions can ask teachers to have students respond to, the teachers feel that these frameworks reduce the College Board's pressure rather than increasing the College Board control. So we value that. We value that perspective from teachers. We believe the teachers should have flexibility to pursue individual topics in much greater depth than they've been able to in the past. So yes, there was misinformation that was circulated. I didn't think it was a big deal, so I didn't flag it earlier. But there was the claim made the College Board is doing a bunch of these, or the College Board is going to start doing a bunch of these, and that this was sprung on the public. Both of those statements were not true. This was released to the public 2 years ago. It was only last summer that these concerns began to percolate. but they've been in the public for 2 years, and the other frameworks are already in your schools and have been in your schools for several years. AP Biology, AP French, AP German, AP Biology, AP Chemistry, AP Physics were all redesigned alongside or earlier than U.S. history. Those frameworks are already in your schools, and in each case, we see the same data. Teacher satisfaction jumps up, and they say, no longer do I feel the pressure from the College Board to be a mile wide and an inch deep. These frameworks give me flexibility to go deep in fewer areas. So we have already released it. To finish out the specific question about U.S. government and politics, we already had a public review period on the U.S. government and politics framework, and that people seem very, very happy with it.
Okay.
One last question.
Yeah. Okay, fine, go ahead.
Pull your mic a little closer.
I usually talk very loudly. I can do that, whether it's working or not. I appreciate what you all are saying, but I have to say this. I have a grandson taking AP U.S. History now at Grayson High School, and I have tried to monitor very carefully what's coming out of that classroom. I see nothing but very positive things, and in talking to his teacher, I have gotten what you're saying, and my grandson will talk about what all he's learning, and I like the fact that he's learning to take credit critically, because I think that's what's so important for kids to learn.
I want to emphasize again that the reason I see that the teachers are expressing satisfaction and claiming flexibility is that they have less factual area to cover. But as Mr. Packer himself said, that's because they're getting concepts from the College Board. And when you start putting out concepts, then you start talking about directing the way U.S. history is understood, directing the way it must be taught, directing what it means. So that time flexibility is bought at the cost of controlling the conceptual presentation of the topic. And that is a dangerous thing for any one company to be able to control.
William, did you have another question?
Well, he answered it right there.
Okay.
So.
Well, there was a real good country song, and it said, "My, ain't it funny how time slips away." I know y'all don't believe we've been here for almost 3 hours, but we have. I'm going to give both you groups of gentlemen about 3 minutes to sum up, and we're going to go home. Trevor?
I guess first and foremost, I think this has been helpful. I appreciate the specificity of the feedback, and that has been frankly rare in discussions so far that have been plagued by hyperbole, inaccuracies, and wild distortions. I didn't feel that today. I felt like the comments were focused on the actual wording of the framework, areas that you would want to see addressed and changed, and I find that very helpful and want to thank you for that. I am less discouraged than Professor Kurtz with the challenge of brokering consensus between the right and the left regarding concepts that all American students should learn in a college-level history course. I frankly see that as a role that the College Board can help play. Because of the relationships we've built with most American colleges and universities over the past 100 years, we can help broker a consensus around the wording of concepts that can be accepted by the right and the left. You may think that's idealistic, but that is the task we've set for ourselves, and we have absolute appetite to pursue that. Because we do believe that there are some things that all Americans should agree should be studied in a college-level history course, and we want to encourage access to those sorts of experiences. This year, Georgia students are on track to earn $62 million of college credit through AP, $7 million through AP US History. We want to preserve those opportunities for students. So thank you for this fruitful conversation.
I would just like to ask that as College Board has been open to revision, that the Senate is open to revision on the SR 80. I think just like College Board has admitted that there's room for change, I think that SR 80 needs some revision as well.
I'd like to finish by emphasizing again the importance of choice. We wouldn't accept a situation in which there were only one textbook available to teach U.S. history. We wouldn't accept a situation and there were only one newspaper available. And newspapers are called the first draft of history. Could we accept a situation in which only, say, the New York Times was the arbiter of the news of the day? It would be intolerable. So how can we accept a situation in which one company determines how the concepts behind American history should be presented. We simply have to open up this market to choice.
I want to talk about flexibility of the Greensboro Board. No. I want to say that as a person who's taught many years, I welcome the give and take that we've had, and I want to congratulate my colleague for doing a fine job, and Mr. Packer for being open to suggestions, and to the committee for staying here and listening to this discussion. So it was a pleasure, and I think we did have a very profitable exchange of ideas, which is what America's all about.
I thank all of you for your attendance, and especially our 4 panelists for making the effort to come, and I appreciate your openness and honesty. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.